I was lying in a hospital bed dying from internal bleeding when I called my father and begged for $30,000 to save my life. He said they didn't have the money. I spent 7 days waiting for them to call back. 7 days wondering if I was worth saving. 7 days learning that when you're the invisible child in your family, even your death is an inconvenience. My college friends ended up crowdsourcing the money. Strangers saved my life because my own parents couldn't be bothered. 1 year later, I saw the Facebook post that changed everything, my younger sister standing beside a brand new $50,000 luxury SUV. The caption, "Family is everything." They found $50,000 for a car. They couldn't find $30,000 to keep me alive. But here's what they didn't know: I'd just hired a private investigator. And what I discovered about my family, about the money they stole, about the inheritance they hid, about the choice they made when I was dying, it rewrote my entire childhood. So I disappeared. I built a company in silence. And 8 years later, when they came crawling back, desperate and bankrupt, begging for help, I had a decision to make. What I did next shocked everyone. The truth I exposed went viral, and the revenge I got. Let's just say it was cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating. This is the story of how I went from the forgotten child to a multi-millionaire CEO, how my golden child sister lost everything, and how my parents finally learned that some betrayals cost more than money. Stay with me until the end, because the twist that destroyed them, you won't see it coming. And trust me, they deserved every second of it. My name is Nicole Gray, and I'm 35 years old now. A CEO, an entrepreneur, a woman who built something from nothing. But this story begins 17 years ago, when I was just turning 18, sitting at a dinner table where I'd already learned to make myself invisible. The dining room looked perfect that evening, like something from a magazine spread. My mother had set out the good china, the kind we only used for special occasions, though I wasn't entirely sure my birthday qualified. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching the edges of the crystal glasses and making everything look warm and golden. My father sat at the head of the table in his usual spot, already scrolling through his phone before the meal even started. My mother bustled between the kitchen and the dining room, bringing out dishes with the kind of focused energy she always had when she was trying to make something seem more important than it felt. And my sister Sarah, 13 years old and luminous in that way only teenagers who know they're adored can be, sat across from me texting someone and smiling at her screen. This was my 18th birthday dinner. I'd made it to adulthood. I'd gotten into college, a good one with a partial scholarship that I'd worked myself sick to earn. I had news to share, the kind of news that should have made my parents proud. But as I looked around that table, I already knew how the evening would go. I'd learned years ago to read the room, to measure the space I was allowed to occupy, and tonight, that space felt particularly small. My mother set down the last platter and sat down with a satisfied sigh. "Well, isn't this nice?" she said, looking around the table with a smile that didn't quite include me in its warmth. "A family dinner. We should do this more often." I opened my mouth to speak, to share my news, but Sarah beat me to it. "Mom, did you remember to call about my recital next week? Mrs. Patterson said the good seats fill up fast, and I really want you guys in the front row." My mother's face lit up in a way I'd seen 1,000 times, that particular brightness she reserved for Sarah's achievements, Sarah's needs, Sarah's everything. "Of course, sweetie. I called this morning. We've got the best seats in the house. Your father's taking the afternoon off work, aren't you, honey?" My father glanced up from his phone long enough to nod. "Wouldn't miss it." I waited for a natural pause in the conversation for a moment when I could interject. "So I got my acceptance letter," I said, trying to keep my voice light, casual, like it wasn't a big deal, even though it was the biggest deal of my young life. "From State University. They're offering me a partial scholarship." "That's nice, dear," my mother said, but her eyes were still on Sarah. "Sarah, make sure you practice that difficult passage tonight. You know the one I mean." "Mom, I'm talking about college," I said a little louder this time, feeling something desperate and small crawling up my throat. "I got in. I'll be the first person in our family to go to a 4-year university." My father looked up then, but there was no pride in his eyes. Just a kind of tired acknowledgement. That's good, Nicole. You've always been self-sufficient. I'm sure you'll figure out the rest of the tuition on your own. You're resourceful like that. Resourceful. That was the word they always used for me. Not brilliant, not accomplished, not beloved. Resourceful. It was code for, you'll handle it yourself, because we're not going to help you. I felt the familiar ache settle in my chest, the one I'd learned to ignore to rationalize away. They weren't bad parents. They just had limited energy, limited resources. Sarah was younger, more sensitive. She needed more attention. I was fine. I'd always been fine. But sitting there at that table with the good china and the golden light and the carefully prepared meal that somehow wasn't really for me, I felt something else stir. A question I'd been carrying for years, one I'd never had the courage to ask. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice quieter now. "About Grandma." The room changed. It wasn't a subtle shift, it was like someone had opened a window and let in a cold wind. My mother's hands stilled on her fork. My father's jaw tightened. "What about her?" My father said, his tone flat. I'd been 5 when my grandmother died, but I remembered her. I remembered sitting on her lap, the smell of her perfume, the way she'd called me her special girl. And I remembered vaguely adults talking in hushed tones about what she'd left behind, about money, about making sure everything was handled properly. "Didn't she leave something for me?" I asked carefully, like I was stepping on ice that might crack. I remember people talking about it at the funeral, about her wanting to make sure I was taken care of. My father's face went hard in a way I'd only seen a few times in my life. When he spoke, his voice was sharp enough to cut. "Don't be greedy, Nicole. Your grandmother had nothing. We used what little there was to raise you. Do you think food and shelter come free?" "I wasn't being greedy," I said quickly, feeling my face flush. "I was just asking." "Well, don't," he said. "That topic is closed." My mother reached across the table to pat Sarah's hand as if my question had somehow upset her golden child. "Let's not ruin dinner with talk about money. Sarah, tell us more about your recital piece." And just like that, I disappeared again. The conversation moved on without me flowing around me like water around a stone. I sat there feeling small and ashamed for even asking, telling myself I'd been inappropriate, ungrateful. Of course there was no inheritance. Of course I'd imagined it, or misunderstood what I'd heard as a child. After dinner, I helped my mother clear the dishes, while Sarah disappeared to her room. As I washed plates in the sink, I heard my parents talking in the living room about getting Sarah a new laptop for her birthday next month. She didn't need one, not for anything specific. Just because. Just because she was Sarah, and Sarah deserved nice things. I'd asked for a laptop 3 months ago for college. I'd been told to get a part-time job and save up for it myself. I'd been working at a coffee shop ever since, putting every spare dollar aside. Standing there with my hands in soapy water, I told myself this was fair. I was older, more independent. I was the strong one. I could handle things myself. Sarah was more sensitive, more delicate. She needed protecting, needed providing for. And me, I was resourceful. I didn't know then what I know now, that strength shouldn't mean you're left to fend for yourself. That independence shouldn't be forced on a child who just wanted to be loved the same way her sister was loved. That being low maintenance shouldn't mean being forgotten. I didn't know that my parents had just lied to my face about the biggest theft of my life. But there are some truths that once learned can never be unlearned. And 5 years later, dying in a hospital bed, I would learn exactly what my life was worth to the people who were supposed to love me most. I moved into my college dorm 3 months after that birthday dinner, and I remember the strange mix of relief and loneliness I felt watching my parents drive away. They'd helped me carry my boxes up to my room, 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. Everything I owned fitting into the back of their sedan with room to spare. My mother had hugged me briefly, told me to call if I needed anything, though we both knew I wouldn't. My father had pressed $200 into my hand with the instruction to make it last. Sarah hadn't come at all. She had a birthday party to attend, something more important than watching her older sister leave home. Standing in that empty dorm room with its bare mattress and institutional lighting, I felt something settle over me like a second skin. This was it. I was on my own now, truly on my own, and somehow that felt less frightening than disappointing. At least when you're alone, you know what to expect. You know you can only count on yourself, and there's a strange comfort in that certainty. That first semester, I learned the unspoken rules of my family with a clarity I'd never had before. Distance gave me perspective, and perspective revealed patterns I'd spent 18 years refusing to see. Love in the Gray family wasn't unconditional. It wasn't even consistent. It was transactional, distributed based on a value system I'd never agreed to but had always been measured against. Sarah brought pride. She was talented, social, the kind of daughter my parents could talk about at church or at their jobs. She won awards for her music. She had friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers. She posted pictures that made our family look warm and functional. My mother showed those pictures to everyone. Sarah was proof that the Grays were doing something right, that they were good parents who raised successful children. And me, I brought stability. I didn't cause problems. I didn't need emotional support or financial help or constant validation. I was the child they didn't have to worry about, because I'd learned not to give them reasons to worry. I'd learned that needing things made me a burden, that asking for help made me ungrateful, that showing struggle made me weak. So I became strong by necessity, independent by survival, low maintenance by design. I didn't realize I was disappearing. By my sophomore year, I was working 2 jobs, mornings at the campus library, evenings waitressing at a restaurant near downtown. I took a full course load, maintained a 3.7 GPA, and slept maybe 5 hours a night. When people asked how I managed it all, I'd shrug and say I was good at time management. The truth was simpler and sadder. I managed because I had to. My partial scholarship covered tuition, but everything else, books, food, rent, the laptop I'd finally saved enough to buy, came from those minimum wage paychecks. I called home once a month, brief conversations where my mother would ask if I was eating enough, and my father would remind me not to waste money. They never asked if I needed help. I never offered that I did. We'd all agreed on our roles in this silent transaction, and to break character now would be to admit something none of us wanted to face. Meanwhile, Sarah's high school years were documented in loving detail on my mother's Facebook page. New car for her 16th birthday, spring break trip to Florida, professional photos for her senior portraits. My mother's captions were always some variation of "so blessed" or "our beautiful girl" or "family is everything." I learned to scroll past those posts without feeling anything. Feeling things was dangerous. Feeling things led to questions I couldn't afford to ask. But late at night, when I was too exhausted to maintain my careful defenses, a question would surface in my mind like something dark rising from deep water. What would they do if I really needed them? Not wanted their help, not hoped for their support, but genuinely, desperately needed them. Would they show up? Would they choose me? Would I finally be worth the effort? I pushed the question away every time it surfaced. Some questions are too frightening to answer because you already know what the answer might be, and knowing would break something inside you that you need to stay intact. So I built my life around never having to find out. I became the daughter who didn't need anything, who could handle everything herself, who was so damn resourceful that my parents could sleep peacefully at night, knowing I'd never be a burden. I developed a mantra that I'd repeat to myself during the hardest moments, when I was studying at 2 a.m. after a double shift, or when I was eating ramen for the 4th night in a row because payday was still 3 days away, or when I saw other students' parents visiting for the weekend with care packages and spending money. If I don't need anything, everything will be okay. If I don't need anything, they can't disappoint me. If I don't need anything, I can't be rejected. It became my survival mechanism, my shield against the truth I wasn't ready to face. I told myself I was being mature, independent adult. I told myself this was what growing up looked like, that everyone had to stand on their own, eventually. That I was just learning earlier than most. I didn't recognize it for what it really was. A child training herself not to expect love, so that the absence of it wouldn't hurt so much. By the time I was 23, I'd perfected the art of needing nothing. I'd graduated college debt-free through sheer force of will and sleepless nights. I had a job, an apartment, a life I'd built entirely on my own. I was proud of that independence. I wore it like armor. I didn't know that armor was about to be tested in a way that would shatter everything I believed about my family, about myself, about what love was supposed to mean. That test is coming sooner than she knows. But before I tell you about that test, you need to understand how deeply my role in this family had been carved into me, how early the patterns were set. Because what happened when I was 23 wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the inevitable conclusion of a story that began when I was 5 years old. I have fragments of memory from the day my grandmother died. I remember my mother's phone ringing early in the morning. Remember the sound she made when she answered it. A gasp that turned into a sob. I remember being told to go play in my room, that something had happened to Grandma, that the grown-ups needed to talk. I sat at the top of the stairs instead, the way children do, listening to voices I wasn't supposed to hear. My grandmother had been the only person in my world who made me feel like I was the center of something. She had warm, soft hands that smelled like the lavender lotion she kept by her kitchen sink. She baked cookies that were always slightly burned on the bottom, and she'd give me the best ones, the ones that were perfectly golden. She called me her special girl. When I stayed at her house, she'd let me sleep in her big bed, and she'd tell me stories about when my mother was young, about all the dreams she'd had. I loved my grandmother with the uncomplicated intensity that only small children can manage. And then she was gone. And in the weeks that followed, the adults in my life spoke in hushed tones about things I didn't understand. Estate, probate, trust, beneficiary. I remember my parents meeting with a man in a suit at our dining room table, papers spread out, their voices low and serious. I remember asking my mother why everyone kept talking about money when Grandma had just died, and my mother had pulled me close and said, "Grandma loved you so much. She wanted to make sure you were taken care of." But then my father had added, his voice carrying a weight I was too young to interpret. "Your grandmother didn't have much, Nicole. What little there was, we'll use to take care of you. We'll make sure it goes toward your future." I nodded, not really understanding, just knowing that something important had happened and that I should be grateful. They never mentioned it again. By the time I was old enough to ask real questions, the topic had been buried so deeply that bringing it up felt like excavating something forbidden. 5 years later, when I was 10, my sister was born, and everything shifted. I remember the excitement in the house during my mother's pregnancy, a kind of energy I'd never felt directed toward me. My parents talked about names, about nursery colors, about all the things they'd do differently this time. This time. As if I'd been a practice, run a rough draft, they were ready to revise. When they brought Sarah home from the hospital, I tried so hard to be good. I wanted to be the helpful big sister, the responsible one. My mother was exhausted. My father was anxious, and I thought if I could just be useful enough, needed enough, I'd earn back some of the attention that had shifted so completely toward this tiny crying creature. "You're the big sister now," my father told me, his hand on my shoulder. "That means you have to be responsible. You have to set an example." I took that responsibility seriously. I helped with bottles and diapers. I entertained Sarah when she was fussy. I did my homework quietly so I wouldn't wake her. I made myself small and helpful and completely undemanding, and I watched them transform the guest room into a nursery painting, the walls a soft yellow, buying a new crib, a changing table, a rocking chair. My room down the hall had the same faded wallpaper it had always had, the same scratched furniture, the same worn carpet. When I asked if we could paint my room too, my mother sighed and said, "We just spent so much money on the baby Nicole. Maybe next year." Next year never came. As Sarah grew, the pattern solidified. There was always money for her needs, her wants, her whims. Dance classes, piano lessons, new clothes for every season, birthday parties with hired entertainers. My parents' faces would light up when she walked into a room, and I'd watch that light dim when they looked at me. I learned to stop asking. By the time I was 13, I'd figured out that the fastest way to avoid disappointment was to need nothing. I started babysitting for neighbors, earning my own money for school supplies, for clothes, for the things other kids' parents just bought without question. When my English teacher said we needed to type our essays, and I mentioned needing a computer, my father said, "The library has computers. You can use those." 3 years later, they bought Sarah a laptop for her 13th birthday. Just because. Not for any specific need, not for school, just because she was Sarah, and Sarah deserved nice things. I remember my mother noticing me watching Sarah unwrap that laptop, and she must have seen something in my face because she said quickly, defensively, "You're so independent, Nicole. You've always been so mature, so capable of handling things yourself. We're really proud of how self-sufficient you are." I smiled and nodded because that's what good daughters do. I didn't tell her that independence isn't a virtue when it's forced on you. I didn't say that maturity shouldn't mean being parentified at 10 years old, that capability shouldn't mean being left to figure everything out alone. I didn't ask why self-sufficiency was praised in me, but coddling was given to Sarah. Instead, I internalized the message, "You are the child who doesn't need anything. Sarah is the child who deserves everything. Your job is to be easy, to be invisible, to be so low maintenance that your parents can pour all their resources into the daughter who really matters." By the time I was 16, I'd perfected invisibility. I worked after school and on weekends. I bought my own prom dress from a thrift store. I applied to colleges on the school's computers during my lunch breaks. I never asked for gas money, for lunch money, for help with anything. My parents praised this independence constantly, and I accepted those words as love, because I didn't know I deserved anything better. I thought I was being strong. I thought I was being mature. I didn't realize I was being trained to expect nothing, to need, nothing, to be, nothing more than a shadow in my own family. And this training would nearly cost Nicole her life. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until I was 28 years old, sitting in a private investigator's office with a folder full of documents that would rewrite my entire childhood, was that my invisibility wasn't just emotional neglect. It was financial theft. And it had started the day my grandmother died. Here's what actually happened. The truth that was hidden from me for 23 years. When my grandmother passed away suddenly from a heart attack, she left behind a will. It was straightforward, written with the help of a lawyer 5 years before her death. The document stated clearly, "I leave $500,000 to be divided equally among all granddaughters of my daughter, Margaret Gray." At the time of her death, I was the only granddaughter. My sister wouldn't be born for another 5 years. That money, all of it, was mine. The will specified that the inheritance would be held in a trust until I turned 18, at which point it would transfer to my name. My parents were named as trustees, which gave them legal authority to manage the funds. The trust document included explicit instructions the money could only be used for the benefit of the child and had to be accounted for in annual reports to the probate court. For the first few years, my parents followed the rules more or less. They used trust funds for legitimate expenses, my preschool tuition, medical bills, clothes, food. The trust earned interest, growing steadily. By the time I was 10, it had reached nearly $580,000. My parents watched that number climb, and something began to shift in how they thought about the money, about me, about the choices they'd made. My mother would later tell me, years after everything fell apart in a moment of defensive honesty, that when Sarah was born, my father had said something she'd never forgotten. They were looking at the trust statements, calculating what would be left by the time I turned 18, and he'd said, "If we'd waited 5 more years to have Nicole, your mother would still have been alive. Both girls could have inherited. It would have been $250,000 each instead of Nicole getting everything." That thought, that terrible, resentful thought, planted itself in their minds and grew like a poisonous vine. They began to see me not as their daughter whose future had been secured by a loving grandmother, but as the child who had taken something from their other daughter. The child whose early arrival had somehow cheated Sarah out of money that in an alternate timeline would have been hers. This twisted logic became their justification for what they did next. They started interpreting, for the benefit of the child, more and more liberally. New car. Well, Nicole needs reliable transportation, and we drive her places, so this counts. Home renovation. Nicole lives here, so improving her living environment is for her benefit. Vacation family bonding is important for child development. They were careful enough that the probate court's cursory annual reviews didn't catch the discrepancies, but creative enough that the trust was bleeding money faster than it was growing. By the time I was 16, they'd spent nearly $200,000 on expenses that had nothing to do with me. They told themselves they deserved it. They were raising me, weren't they? They were providing a home food stability. The money was just compensation for 18 years of parenting, and besides, it balanced things out. Sarah hadn't gotten anything from Grandma. This way, both daughters were being invested in equally. The lies we tell ourselves to justify our worst choices are always the most elaborate. When I turned 18 and sat at that birthday dinner asking about my grandmother's inheritance, my parents knew exactly what I was talking about. They'd been dreading that question for years, had prepared their response, had rehearsed the righteous indignation they'd need to shut down the conversation. There was still about $150,000 left in the trust money that should have transferred to my name. Money that could have paid for my entire college education and then some. Instead, 3 weeks after my 18th birthday, my parents went to their lawyer. They had me sign papers, told me they were just formalities closing out old accounts from when I was a minor. I signed without reading, carefully trusting them the way children trust their parents, not understanding that I was signing documents that claimed I'd received the full benefit of the trust during my minority and waive all rights to remaining funds. The lawyer, barely ethical enough to stay licensed, processed the paperwork. The remaining $150,000 stayed in my parents' control. They deposited it into an account in their names, convinced themselves it was rightfully theirs, and began planning how to spend it. Sarah's college fund, home improvements, a comfortable cushion for their retirement. My inheritance became their nest egg, and I was never supposed to know it had existed in the first place. They convinced themselves this was fair. In their minds, they'd created a narrative where they were the victims of bad timing, and I was the accidental beneficiary of circumstances that had excluded their other daughter. They rationalized every dollar they'd taken, every lie they'd told, every time they'd left me to struggle financially while sitting on money my grandmother had left specifically for me. What they didn't anticipate was that their resentment would curdle into something darker. They'd spent 13 years watching that trust fund, thinking of it as Nicole's money, and even after they'd legally stolen it, they still somehow associated me with having taken something from Sarah. It was completely irrational, but resentment doesn't follow logic. They'd started seeing me as the child who'd cost them something, who'd arrived at the wrong time, who'd gotten more than her fair share just by being born first. This poisoned perspective would color every interaction we had. Every time they chose Sarah over me, every time they praised my independence while funding Sarah's dependence, every time they found money for her. But not for me. It was all justified in their minds by this twisted arithmetic, where I'd already gotten mine even though I'd never seen a penny of it. And when Nicole would need them most, this lie would determine whether she lived or died. 5 years passed. I turned 23 in March, celebrated alone in my studio apartment with a cupcake from the grocery store and a phone call from my friend Sarah, the only person who remembered without Facebook reminding her. I'd graduated college the year before, walked across that stage with my earned degree and my burden of student loans. I was working 2 jobs, managing a small marketing firm during the day and waitressing 3 nights a week to make ends meet. My apartment was barely 400 square feet, but it was mine. My car was 12 years old and burning oil, but it ran. My life was small and hard and entirely self-made, and I told myself I was proud of that. The truth was lonelier. I talked to my parents maybe once a month, brief calls, where my mother would ask if I was eating enough vegetables, and my father would remind me to check my tire pressure. I visited on major holidays, sat at that same dining room table where I'd learned to make myself invisible, watched Sarah, now 18 and fresh out of high school, talk about her gap year plans and her upcoming college experience fully funded by our parents. The relationship was cordial in the way relationships are when everyone has agreed not to look too closely at the foundation. I still didn't know about the inheritance. I believed what they'd told me, that my grandmother had left little, that what existed had been used to raise me, that I had no right to expect more. I'd built my independence on that belief, worn my self-sufficiency like a badge of honor. Sometimes late at night I felt a loneliness I couldn't name, a hollow place in my chest that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being unseen. But I pushed it away. I was fine. I'd always been fine. It was a Tuesday in November when my carefully constructed independence shattered. I was driving home from my waitressing shift at 11:30 at night, exhausted in that bone-deep way that comes from working 14-hour days. The road was dark, nearly empty, just me and the occasional passing headlights. I remember feeling my eyelids getting heavy, remember shaking my head to stay alert, remember thinking I just needed to make it another 10 minutes and I'd be home. I never saw the other car. Later, the police would tell me the other driver was drunk, that he'd blown through a red light going 60 in a 35 zone. They'd tell me it was a miracle I survived the initial impact. They'd tell me a lot of things, but in the moment, there was just the sound metal screaming glass, exploding, the world spinning, and then nothing. I woke up in the ICU 3 days later. The nurse told me I'd been unconscious, that they'd had to stabilize me before I could wake up, that I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like my body was made of broken glass. Every breath a knife, every small movement agony. There were tubes and wires and machines beeping steadily around me, and when I tried to understand what the doctors were saying, their words seemed to come from very far away. Internal bleeding, fractured ribs, skull fracture, brain swelling. Surgery required. A social worker came to my bedside on the 4th day. She was kind, her voice gentle, as she explained that they'd contacted my emergency contact, my parents, and that they were aware of my situation. Then she brought in the surgeon, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, who didn't waste time with bedside manner. "Your insurance covered the initial stabilization," she said, pulling up a chair. "That was about $10,000. But you need surgery to address the internal bleeding and repair the damage. Without it, you have maybe a week before the bleeding becomes fatal. The surgery costs $40,000. Your insurance covers another $10,000. That leaves $30,000 out of pocket. Do you have savings? Family who can help? $30,000. I had maybe $800 in my checking account. My credit cards were maxed from books and living expenses. I had no savings. I had nothing except a family who'd spent my entire life teaching me not to ask them for anything. But I was dying. That clarifies things. With shaking hands, I asked the nurse to bring me my phone. I stared at my father's contact information for a long time before I pressed call. My mouth was dry. My hands were trembling. Every nerve in my body was screaming that asking for help was dangerous, that needing something would only lead to disappointment, but I was out of options. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Nicole." "The hospital called. How are you feeling?" "Dad," my voice cracked. "I need help. I need surgery. The doctor says without it I'll die within a week." "Okay." His tone was careful, measured. "What do you need?" $30,000. I know it's a lot. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. Dad, I'm scared." There was a pause. A long pause. Long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then, "Nicole, we don't have that kind of money." "Dad, I'll die." Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear my mother's voice in the background, couldn't make out the words. Then my father came back on the line. "Let us think about it. We'll need to look at our finances, see what we can do. We'll call you back." "When?" "Soon. We'll call you back soon." The line went dead. I lay there in that hospital bed, staring at the phone in my hand, waiting for it to ring. That day passed, then the next. The surgeon came back, asked if I'd secured funding. I told her my parents were working on it. She looked at me with something like pity and said I had 5 days left, maybe 6. My parents didn't call. They didn't visit. They didn't text. I was alone in that hospital room, dying by degrees, waiting for the people who'd raised me to decide whether I was worth saving. And somewhere in that forced stillness, that terrible waiting, I began to understand that I'd spent 23 years avoiding a question I couldn't avoid anymore. What would they do if I really needed them? Now I knew. What she doesn't know is that her parents are having a very different conversation at home. I didn't know it then, I wouldn't know for years. But while I lay in that hospital bed watching the hours tick away, my parents were sitting at their kitchen table discussing my life over morning coffee. My mother would tell me about this conversation much later during one of our final confrontations, and the casual mundanity of it was somehow worse than if they'd been actively cruel. They weren't villains in a dark room plotting my demise. They were just two people who'd spent 23 years prioritizing one daughter over another, and now that value system was being tested with life and death stakes. "We don't have $30,000 liquid," my father had said, adding cream to his coffee. "We have the home equity line," my mother replied. "We took it out last year. There's $40,000 available." A long pause. The kind of pause where a decision gets made without anyone saying the words out loud. "That's for Sarah's college," my father said finally. "She starts in the fall. We promised her. Nicole has insurance. They said they stabilized her. Maybe she doesn't need the surgery right away. Maybe there are other options. Payment plans." "In a week," they said. Another pause. Then my father and my mother would later swear he said this hesitantly, uncomfortably. "Her life insurance policy. We're still the beneficiaries, right? From when she was 18. "Don't say it like that," my mother had responded. But according to her own account, she didn't say he was wrong. She didn't say they should help me. She just said, "Don't say it like that," as if the problem was the words, not the thought behind them. They decided to wait, to see what happened, to hope that somehow the problem would resolve itself without them having to sacrifice anything for the daughter who'd always been so good at handling things on her own. But I knew none of this on day 5 when I woke up to find Sarah sitting beside my hospital bed. Not Sarah, my sister. Sarah Chen, my college roommate from sophomore year, the friend who'd stuck with me through late-night study sessions and early morning work shifts, who knew me in a way my own family never had. Someone had contacted her, maybe the hospital, maybe a mutual friend, and she'd driven 3 hours the moment she heard. "Nicole," she said, and her eyes were red. "Why didn't you call me?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know how to explain that I'd been so conditioned not to ask for help that even dying hadn't broken that programming, that I'd called my parents because that felt like the proper order of things, even knowing how it would probably end. Sarah didn't wait for explanations. She pulled out her phone, and within an hour she'd created a GoFundMe page. The description was simple and devastating. "My best friend is dying. Her insurance won't cover the surgery she needs. Her family can't help. But I know she's saved every person she's ever worked with, helped every friend who's needed her, given everything to everyone without asking for anything back. Now she needs us. Please help me save her life." She shared it everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. She texted everyone we'd gone to college with. She posted it in the break room at my day job in the restaurant where I waited tables. She told my story to anyone who would listen. The response was immediate and overwhelming. $20 from a coworker I barely knew, $50 from someone I'd tutored in college, $100 from the manager at the restaurant who said I'd covered her shifts when her mother was sick. My old professors contributed. People I'd worked with years ago contributed. Complete strangers who'd never met me but recognized their own struggles in my story contributed. Within 3 days, the GoFundMe had raised $32,000. Strangers saved my life. People who owed me nothing gave me everything. And my parents, who'd raised me for 18 years, who had my inheritance sitting in their account, who had a home equity line with my name literally attached to the house, chose to wait and see if I'd die on my own. The surgery happened on day 6. I remember being wheeled into the operating room groggy from pre-op medication and Sarah squeezing my hand. "I'll be here when you wake up," she promised. And she was. My parents sent flowers on day 7. Grocery store carnations with a card that said, "Glad you're feeling better. We knew you'd figure it out. Love, Mom and Dad." I stared at that card for a long time, reading those words over and over. We knew you'd figure it out, as if my near death had been a math problem I needed to solve, as if their absence had been confidence in my abilities rather than abandonment. They called once during my recovery, a brief conversation where my mother said they'd been so worried, and my father said medical bills were tough, but I'd manage, and neither of them acknowledged that they'd let me spend nearly a week dying, while they decided whether I was worth the cost of saving. I was released from the hospital 2 weeks after the accident. Sarah drove me home to my apartment, helped me up the stairs, stocked my refrigerator with groceries she'd paid for. "You're staying with me for a month," she announced. "Non-negotiable. You need someone to help you recover." I tried to argue, tried to say I could handle it myself, but Sarah just looked at me with those knowing eyes and said, "Nicole, I need you to understand something. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's human. And the fact that your family made you think otherwise is not your fault." 3 days after I got home, scrolling through Facebook during one of my many hours of forced bed rest, I saw the post that would change everything. And when she's released from the hospital, she sees something that makes the betrayal crystal clear. Recovery was a study in cognitive dissonance. 6 weeks of my body slowly knitting itself back together while my mind performed elaborate gymnastics trying to make sense of what my parents had done, or more accurately, what they hadn't done. They visited once. On a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week, they showed up at Sarah's apartment where I was staying, bearing grocery store flowers and careful smiles. They stayed for 37 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, counting down until they'd leave, and I could stop pretending everything was normal. My mother fussed over the flowers, arranging them in a borrowed vase. My father sat stiffly on Sarah's couch, commenting on the nice place she had. They asked about my recovery in the general way people ask about things they don't really want detailed answers to. How was I feeling? Better. That's good. Physical therapy going well. Great. I watched them carefully, looking for signs of guilt, of shame, of any acknowledgement of what had happened. What I saw instead was something I couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly, that I'd survived. But underneath that, something else. Something that looked almost like disappointment. I told myself immediately that I was being paranoid, that the pain medication was making me see things that weren't there, that I was being unfair. "We're so glad you're okay," my mother said, patting my hand. "We were so worried." "We wanted to help," my father added. And there it was, the explanation I'd been waiting for. But with unexpected expenses, we just couldn't swing that kind of money. You understand? I wanted to ask what unexpected expenses. I wanted to ask about the home equity line I'd somehow learned they had. I wanted to ask why they hadn't even visited me while I was dying. But I didn't, because I needed to believe them. I needed their words to be true because the alternative was too devastating to consider. "I understand," I heard myself say. After they left, Sarah came back from her deliberate absence and found me staring at the flowers. "You okay?" she asked. "They couldn't afford it," I said, testing the words. "They had unexpected expenses." Sarah's expression told me exactly what she thought of that explanation, but she just said, "Okay," and started making dinner. But I couldn't let it go. For weeks, I constructed elaborate excuses for them, building a fortress of justification around their absence. Maybe they really were broke. Medical expenses, car repairs, things I didn't know about. Maybe they'd been planning to help, but the GoFundMe happened so quickly they didn't have time. Maybe they'd been paralyzed with fear, unable to face the hospital, unable to see me that way. People respond to crisis differently, right? Maybe their absence was shock, not abandonment. I told myself these stories so many times I almost believed them. Almost. The problem was the math. Every time I tried to make their behavior make sense, I ran into the same wall they'd had nearly a week. 7 days to find $30,000. 7 days to visit me, to sit beside my bed, to hold my hand while I was terrified. They'd managed neither. And underneath all my excuses, all my rationalization, the anger was building. But anger felt wrong, ungrateful. They'd raised me for 18 years. They'd fed me, clothed me, kept a roof over my head. Didn't I owe them something? Didn't that count for more than one medical emergency? Maybe I was being unfair, holding them to an impossible standard. Maybe I was the problem too, demanding, too needy, too willing to hold a grudge over a situation they couldn't control. This internal debate consumed me. I'd swing between hurt and guilt, anger and shame sometimes in the span of a single hour. Sarah would find me crying and ask what was wrong, and I'd say I didn't know. Because I didn't. I didn't know how to reconcile the parents I'd wanted to believe I had with the parents whose actions or lack of actions told a very different story. "Nicole," Sarah said one evening, sitting beside me on the couch, "they let you nearly die." "It's more complicated than that," I replied automatically. "You don't understand family dynamics. I understand that my parents would have sold their house to save me. I understand that family means showing up when someone needs you. I understand that what they did was not okay, and you making excuses for them doesn't change that." I turned away from her not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and I wasn't ready to face that truth yet. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and Sarah was asleep, and the pain medication couldn't touch the deeper ache, I'd lie awake and ask myself the question I'd been avoiding since the moment my father said, "Let us think about it," and hung up the phone. If it had been Sarah in that hospital bed, would they have found the money? I knew the answer. I'd known it my whole life, really. I'd just never had to face it so starkly, so undeniably. They would have mortgaged the house. They would have drained their retirement accounts. They would have sold everything they owned. For Sarah, there would have been no debate, no thinking about it, no calculated waiting to see if the problem resolved itself. For me, there had been grocery store flowers and carefully worded explanations. Knowing and accepting are different things. I knew what their choice meant. But accepting it, letting that truth reshape how I understood my entire childhood, my entire relationship with them, that was something else entirely. So I did what I'd always done when emotions got too complicated. I created distance. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. I stopped calling. When they called, I kept conversations brief and surface level. I made excuses not to visit. I let weeks become months, let the space between us grow wider and quieter until our relationship existed mostly in the past tense. I told myself I was focusing on recovery, on rebuilding my life. I told myself I needed time. I didn't tell myself the truth that I was protecting myself from the final test, from having to ask whether the love I'd wanted from them had ever really existed at all. 8 months after the accident, I was back on my feet. Back to work, back to my apartment, back to building the life I'd always built alone. I'd paid back every penny of the GoFundMe to the donors who'd accept it. I'd started physical therapy. I'd learned to live with the scars, both visible and not. And then one evening, scrolling mindlessly through Facebook while eating takeout on my couch, I saw the post that would make avoiding the truth impossible. And then she sees the Facebook post that changes everything. It was a Thursday evening in October 1 year and 3 days after the accident. I was sitting on the couch in my new apartment in a city 2 hours away from where I'd grown up, eating pad thai from the container and half watching a documentary about ocean life. I'd changed jobs, found a better position at a tech company doing marketing work that paid enough I'd only needed one job for the first time in years. I'd started therapy. I'd been no contact with my family for 8 months, and while it was painful, it was also peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Like the absence of a constant low-grade headache you didn't realize you had until it finally stopped. I was scrolling through Facebook mindlessly the way you do when you're tired and don't want to think when the post appeared in my feed. The algorithm had decided I still wanted to see updates from my mother despite my silence. And there it was, a photo of Sarah, 19 years old and glowing, standing beside a pristine white luxury SUV with a massive red bow on the hood. The caption read, "So proud of our baby girl graduating high school. She deserves the world. Family is everything." I stopped chewing. I stared at the screen at my sister's radiant smile at the gleaming vehicle that had probably cost more than I'd earned in the past 2 years combined. At the comments already flooding in congratulations, "She's so lucky, what an amazing gift, best parents ever." My mother had replied to one comment already. I clicked to expand the thread. "We saved for years for this. Nothing is too good for our daughter." I read that sentence 3 times. "We saved for years for this. Nothing is too good for our daughter." The pad thai container slipped from my hands onto the coffee table. I didn't notice. My parents, who 13 months ago had told me they didn't have $30,000 to save my life, had just spent $50,000 on a car for a teenager who'd just graduated high school. Not even a particularly distinguished graduation. Sarah had barely scraped by with a C. Average had dropped out of most of her activities, had spent her senior year posting party photos and complaints about homework. But she deserved the world, apparently. She deserved a $50,000 vehicle, while I'd deserved to wait in a hospital bed bleeding internally, wondering if I was going to die alone. The math was simple and devastating. $50,000. $30,000. They'd had $20,000 more than they'd needed to save me, and they'd chosen to spend it on a car instead. Except that wasn't quite right, was it? Because they'd bought the car now a year later, which meant they'd had this money all along, or they'd had access to it, or they'd been able to get it when they wanted to. I sat there on my couch, the documentary still playing, David Attenborough's voice narrating something about coral reefs, and I felt something inside me that wasn't heartbreak. My heart had broken in that hospital. This was something else. This was the sound of a lock clicking open of a door I'd kept carefully closed, suddenly swinging wide. This was clarity. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't immediately call them or comment on the post or text Sarah to ask what the hell was wrong with our family. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I got angry in a cold, calculated way. I got methodical. I opened my laptop and started searching. Private investigators in my area. I read reviews, compared rates, looked for someone who specialized in financial investigations and estate law. It took me 2 hours to find the right person, a former lawyer named Patricia Kim, who'd transitioned into investigative work and had excellent reviews for thoroughness and discretion. I emailed her at 11 that night. "I need to investigate my grandmother's estate from 19 years ago. I believe my parents may have misrepresented what I was entitled to inherit. I need documentation of what existed, where it went, and whether any fraud occurred." She responded the next morning. We set up a meeting for that afternoon. But before I went to that meeting, I sat in my apartment and forced myself to remember things I'd been trying to forget. That 18th birthday dinner when I'd asked about my grandmother's inheritance, and my father's face had gone hard, his voice sharp. "Don't be greedy, Nicole." The way he'd shut down the conversation so completely, so absolutely, as if I'd violated some unspoken rule just by asking. I remembered fragments from childhood pieces of conversation I'd heard when adults thought I wasn't listening. After my grandmother's funeral, relatives saying things like, "At least she left something for the baby," and "Margaret and Tom will have to be careful how they use it," and "It's good Nicole will be taken care of." I'd been 5. I hadn't understood what they meant. I remembered my mother years later during an argument about why I couldn't have new school clothes when Sarah always seemed to have them. My mother had snapped, unusually frustrated, "Do you think the money from your grandmother was infinite? We had to use it to raise you and it's gone now." I'd been 13. I'd registered the words but not their implications, too focused on feeling guilty for asking for things. If there was no inheritance, what money had my mother been talking about? I went to Patricia Kim's office that Friday with a simple question. My grandmother died when I was 5. I was told she left nothing. I think that might be a lie. Can you find out the truth? Patricia looked at me across her organized desk, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. If there was a will, it's public record. If there was a trust, that's trickier but not impossible. Give me her full name, date of death, and county. Give me your parents' names. I'll need a retainer of $1,500, and I'll need you to prepare yourself for what I might find. What do you mean? I mean, she said carefully, that people don't usually hire investigators to look into family estates unless they already suspect something's wrong. And in my experience, when someone suspects their family stole from them, they're usually right. The question is how much and whether it's prosecutable. Are you prepared for those answers? I thought about that hospital bed, about the flowers my parents brought 3 weeks too late, about my sister's $50,000 car, and my mother's words, "Nothing is too good for our daughter." Singular, not daughters. Daughter. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. I wasn't actually, but I would be. What Nicole will discover will rewrite her entire childhood. Patricia Kim called me 3 months later on a Tuesday morning in January. I was at work sitting in a meeting about Q1 marketing strategy when my phone buzzed. I saw her name on the screen and excused myself, my heart suddenly pounding in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. I found everything, she said without preamble. Can you come to my office today? This isn't a conversation for the phone. I left work early, told my boss I had a family emergency, which was true in a way I couldn't begin to explain. The drive to Patricia's office felt both infinite and instantaneous. I kept my mind deliberately blank, refusing to speculate, refusing to hope or fear or feel anything until I knew. Patricia's desk was covered with documents when I arrived. File folders, printed bank statements, copies of legal papers with official seals. She gestured for me to sit and poured me a glass of water without asking if I wanted it. Your instinct was correct, she said. There was an inheritance, a substantial one. She slid the first document across the desk. It was a will dated 6 months before my grandmother's death, signed and notarized. I read the relevant passage 3 times. I leave $500,000 to be divided equally among all granddaughters of my daughter Margaret Gray. You were 5 when she died, Patricia said. You were the only granddaughter. This was entirely yours. $500,000, $500,000. The number didn't feel real. The money went into a trust, Patricia continued, pulling out more documents. Your parents were named trustees. The trust terms were standard funds to be used for your benefit during minority full transfer of remaining assets at age 18. Here are the bank statements. She spread them out like cards in a terrible hand of solitaire. I could see the balance, $500,000, initially growing with interest. Then the withdrawals began. Small at first, legitimate expenses, she explained. Preschool tuition, medical bills, clothes and food and normal childhood costs. But then, when I was 12, a withdrawal for $28,000. That matches the purchase date of a new Honda Accord registered to your father, Patricia said. When I was 15, $45,000. Home renovation. I found the contractor receipts. New kitchen bathroom remodel. When I was 17, $30,000. I couldn't track this one specifically, but the timing matches your sister's beginning high school. New laptop, bedroom furniture, the start of her various lessons and activities. And then, last year, $50,000. I didn't need Patricia to tell me what that one was for. I'd seen it on Facebook, gleaming white with a red bow. Some of these expenses could potentially be justified as for your benefit, Patricia said carefully. A stable home, reliable transportation. But the courts generally expect trustees to be conservative to preserve the principal. Your parents were not conservative? How much is left? My voice sounded strange, distant. As of your 18th birthday, when the trust should have transferred to you, there was approximately $155,000 remaining. Should have transferred. Those words hung in the air. What happened to it? Patricia pulled out another document. 3 weeks after your 18th birthday, your parents went to the bank with papers that claimed you had waived your rights to the trust funds, agreeing that remaining assets would be used for ongoing family expenses. The signature on the waiver is yours. I stared at the signature. It was mine. I remembered signing something. Remembered my father putting papers in front of me saying they were just formalities, closing out old accounts now that I was an adult. I'd trusted him. I'd signed without reading, without understanding, because children trust their parents, and I'd still been a child in all the ways that mattered. Is that legal? I asked. Technically, it depends. If you signed under duress or without full disclosure of what you were signing, probably not. But proving that 18 years later is difficult. What's not ambiguous is what they did with the money afterward. She showed me more statements. The remaining $155,000 withdrawn steadily over 5 years. By the time I was 23, the account held just $35,000. And then, Patricia said, her voice gentler now, I found the emails. She turned her laptop toward me. Email correspondence between my parents dated to the week I was in the hospital. My mother had forwarded my father the message from the hospital about my surgery costs. I read my father's response, "That's $30K, we don't have liquid. The trust has $35K, but that's earmarked for Sarah's first year at college. We can't use Nicole's inheritance money for this. There won't be anything left for Sarah." My mother's reply, "Maybe the GoFundMe will work. Or maybe the hospital will work out a payment plan. Nicole has insurance. They said they stabilized her." My father, "If worse comes to worst, we're still beneficiaries on her life insurance policy from when she was 18. Not that I'm saying, just that we wouldn't be completely without recourse." I stopped reading. The words blurred. Patricia reached across the desk and took the laptop back. "They had $35,000 of your money," she said quietly. "They chose not to use it to save your life because they'd already allocated it for your sister's college fund. They let you lie in that hospital, potentially dying, rather than spend the last remnants of your grandmother's inheritance, on you." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The room felt very far away. Patricia let me sit in silence for a long moment. Then she said, "I can recommend lawyers. We can discuss whether you want to pursue legal action. The statute of limitations is complicated, but there may be options. Or you can simply have the documentation know the truth and decide what to do with it on your own timeline. But Nicole, I need you to understand something." I looked up at her. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't parental oversight or bad financial management. This was systematic theft. They stole your inheritance. They forged legal documents or manipulated you into signing away your rights. And when you were dying, they chose to protect money they'd already stolen, rather than use it for its intended purpose, your welfare. This is fraud. This is betrayal. And you need to let yourself feel the full weight of that. I left her office with a thumb drive containing every document, every email, every bank statement. I drove home on autopilot. I walked into my apartment, set the drive on my kitchen counter, and stood there staring at it. For 3 days, I didn't eat. I barely slept. I called in sick to work. Sarah texted asking if I was okay, and I didn't know how to answer. I sat on my couch, sometimes crying, sometimes numb, turning the truth over and over in my mind like a Rubik's Cube I couldn't solve. My grandmother had left me $500,000 to ensure I'd be taken care of. My parents had spent it on themselves and my sister. And when I'd needed just a fraction of it to survive, they'd chosen to let me die rather than give me what was already mine. Nicole sits with this information for 3 days, not eating, not sleeping, just thinking, what do I do now? On the 4th day, I woke up with clarity I hadn't expected. I'd cried myself empty. I'd run through every possible response in my mind, calling a lawyer, confronting them, posting everything on social media, sending the evidence to everyone they knew. I'd imagined 1,000 different ways to make them pay, to force them to acknowledge what they'd done, to extract some form of justice from the wreckage of my childhood. And then I'd done the math. I called Patricia Kim. "What are my legal options?" I asked. "Realistically." She was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, it's complicated. The statute of limitations for fraud in this state is 6 years from discovery. You just discovered it, so you're within that window. But proving fraud when you sign documents, even under duress, is difficult. Your parents can claim you understood what you were signing. They can claim all expenses were legitimate. A lawsuit would cost you $50,000 minimum, take years, destroy what's left of your family relationships, and you might not win. And if I did win, you might recover some portion of what was taken. After legal fees, maybe $100,000, maybe less. And your parents would probably declare bankruptcy to avoid paying." I sat with that. $100,000 after years of litigation and public family destruction. Money I'd spend the rest of my life knowing came from tearing my family apart in court, even if they deserved it. "What if I don't sue?" I asked. "Then you have information. Knowledge is its own kind of power. What you do with it is up to you." I thanked her and hung up. And then I made a decision that surprised me. I didn't want their money back. It was tainted, blood-soaked, built on betrayal. Taking it back wouldn't heal what was broken. It would just mean years of my life consumed by legal battles, by forcing them to acknowledge what they'd never willingly admit. What I wanted was something else entirely. I wanted to become so successful, so undeniably powerful, that their rejection of me would haunt them. I wanted their choice to let me nearly die to become the biggest mistake of their lives. Not because I needed revenge, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was worth more than they'd ever believed, that I could build something so magnificent they'd spend the rest of their lives knowing what they'd thrown away. That night, I drafted an email to my parents. Short, clean, with no hint of what I knew. "Mom and Dad, I need to focus on my career right now. I'm going to take some time away from family obligations. I'll reach out when I'm ready. Nicole." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I changed my phone number, blocked them on every social media platform, created new accounts under a slightly different name so they couldn't find me. I disappeared into my own life so completely it was like I'd never existed in theirs. My mother replied to the email, "We understand, honey. Focus on your work. We love you." That was it. No fight to keep me. No questions about why. Just relief barely disguised that the difficult daughter had removed herself without requiring them to make any hard decisions. Sarah didn't reach out at all. We'd been strangers masquerading as sisters for so long that my absence probably barely registered. I took the rage I felt, the grief, the sense of betrayal so profound it felt like drowning, and I turned it into fuel. I started working 80-hour weeks, arriving at the office before anyone else and leaving long after dark. I saved every penny I didn't need for bare survival. I read business books until my eyes burned. I attended every networking event I could find, forcing myself to be charming and memorable despite my natural introversion. That's where I met Marcus Chen. He was speaking at a tech conference I'd scraped together, money to attend a retired CEO in his early 60s who'd built and sold 3 companies. His talk was about resilience in entrepreneurship, about the failures that taught him more than successes ever could. Afterward, during the networking session, I approached him with a question I'd been genuinely curious about, not trying to network, but just wanting to understand. "You said your first company failed because you didn't understand your market," I said. "How did you learn to really see what customers needed instead of what you thought they needed?" He looked at me with sharp, assessing eyes. "Most people ask me about exits or funding. You're asking about market research. The rest doesn't matter if you build something nobody wants." He smiled. "You're right. Walk with me." We talked for 30 minutes. He asked what I did, And I told him about my marketing job, about ideas I had for optimization, about patterns I'd noticed in how companies wasted resources. He asked if I'd ever thought about consulting, about starting my own firm. I admitted I had, but didn't have the capital or connections. Capital you can get, he said. Connections you build. But hunger, real hunger, that's something you either have or you don't. You have it. I can see it in your eyes. He gave me his card. Email me a business plan. A real one. I want to see if you think as well as you talk. I spent 2 weeks on that plan, working late into every night, researching every detail, building something so thorough and compelling that he couldn't dismiss it. When I sent it to him, I didn't expect a response. He called me 3 days later. When can you meet? I want to discuss mentorship. Marcus didn't know my story. I never told him about my family, about the inheritance, about the hospital. He just saw someone driven, someone hungry in a way that suggested running from something or towards something with equal desperation. He recognized it because he'd been there himself decades ago, though his demons were different than mine. He taught me everything. Not just business strategy and financial planning, but how to think strategically, how to see 3 moves ahead, how to build something that would last. He introduced me to people. He reviewed my work with brutal honesty. He pushed me harder than anyone had ever pushed me, and I was grateful for it because it meant I was too busy to think about what I'd lost, what had been stolen, what might have been. I wasn't just learning to succeed. I was learning to become untouchable, someone so self-sufficient, so capable, so undeniably valuable that I'd never need anything from anyone ever again. Someone who could look at the family that had betrayed her and feel nothing but pity for what they'd never understand they'd lost. The months blurred together. Work, learning, building. My life became singular in its focus. Sarah, my best friend, worried I was burning out. Marcus warned me that sustainable success required balance. I nodded and agreed, and then worked another 16-hour day. I was building something. Not just a career, but a fortress. And I had no idea that while I was doing that, the family I'd left behind was starting to crack. While Nicole builds her empire in silence, her family's world is about to start crumbling. 3 years after the accident, on the morning I turned 26, I signed the lease on my first real office space. It was small, just 2 rooms in a converted warehouse building, but it was mine. The sign on the door read, Gray Solutions Business Optimization Consulting. And seeing my name there, my company felt like planting a flag on territory I'd conquered through sheer force of will. Sarah Chen. My best friend, my sister in all the ways that mattered, had become my CFO 6 months earlier. She'd left her stable corporate job to join me, believing in what we were building even when it meant taking a pay cut and a risk. Marcus had introduced us to our first 3 clients, all small companies struggling with operational inefficiency, and we'd turned them around so dramatically that referrals started coming in faster than we could handle them. I was making $150,000 a year, more money than my parents had ever made in their best years. I lived in the same modest apartment, drove the same aging car, ate most of my meals at my desk. Every extra dollar went back into the business, into courses and certifications, into building something that couldn't be taken away. I was studying financial management at night, taking negotiation workshops on weekends, learning everything I could about turning a small consulting firm into something substantial. My life had become beautifully simple in its singular focus. Work, learn, build. I had Sarah, who knew everything about the inheritance theft and loved me anyway. I had Marcus, who'd become the father figure I'd never had, tough and demanding but genuinely invested in my success. I had a small circle of friends from networking events and industry conferences, people who knew me as Nicole, the entrepreneur, not Nicole, the abandoned daughter. This was my chosen family, small, fierce, unshakable. And they were enough. I told myself I'd moved on from my biological family, told myself I rarely thought about them, but that wasn't entirely true. Late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself opening Facebook on my laptop, logged into a fake account I'd created with a random name and a stock photo profile picture. I'd navigate to my mother's page, my father's, Sarah's, and I'd scroll through their lives like watching a documentary about strangers. The cracks had started showing about a year after I'd disappeared. My father's posts, once full of fishing photos and dad jokes, had shifted to vague complaints about tough economic times and the cost of everything these days. He'd share articles about inflation, about the struggles of middle-class families, about the unfairness of modern life. Reading between the lines, I could see the financial stress. My mother's posts had become less frequent. She used to document everything, every meal, every family gathering, every small accomplishment. Now, weeks would pass between updates, and when she did post, it was usually just resharing inspirational quotes about perseverance or faith. The photos of Sarah became less frequent, the captions less effusive. Sarah herself was a different story. Her Facebook was a constant stream of party photos, club selfies, complaints about work and relationship drama. She'd dropped out of college after 1 year. I'd learned this through a terse post from my mother about supporting Sarah's decision to take a different path. The $50,000 car had been totaled in an accident 6 months after she got it. I'd found the post about it, Sarah trying to make light of it. Oops, had a little accident, but I'm fine. Car is not LOL. At least I have good insurance. The comments from my mother were telling. We're just grateful you're safe, sweetie. We'll figure out the rest. Figure out the rest. Code for, we'll buy you another car we can't afford. I could see it all from my distant vantage point, the way my parents had bet everything on Sarah being their golden ticket to some kind of validation or success, and how that bet was failing spectacularly. The home equity loan they'd taken out for college that wasn't being attended. The lifestyle they'd maintained beyond their means. The retirement they hadn't saved for because they'd spent my inheritance propping up the illusion that everything was fine. Watching it unfold, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction in their struggles, not pity for their poor choices, not even residual anger, though I'd felt plenty of that in the first year. Just distance. They were people I used to know making predictable mistakes, living out the consequences of their decisions. Sometimes Sarah would catch me late at night, laptop open to those Facebook pages, and she'd sit down beside me without saying anything. Once she asked, "Do you want them to fail?" I thought about it for a long time. "No," I said finally. "I don't want anything for them. I don't want them to suffer. I don't want them to succeed. I just want to not care." "Do you not care?" "I'm working on it." Marcus had a different perspective. When I mentioned my family once, obliquely in the context of understanding what motivates people to make self-destructive financial choices, he'd looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "You're building this company like you're trying to prove something. To who?" "To myself," I'd answered. He'd said, unconvinced. "Just make sure you know when you've proven it. Because there's no finish line if you're running from something instead of toward something." I'd thought about that conversation for weeks. Was I running from my family or toward my own version of success? The honest answer was probably both. Every client I helped, every dollar I earned, every milestone I hit, felt like evidence that I was worth more than they'd believed. That their choice to value Sarah over me had been wrong, demonstrably, provably wrong. But Marcus was right about one thing: I hadn't moved on. Not really. I'd just been preparing. Building myself into someone strong enough that when the inevitable moment came, when my family's world collapsed enough that they'd reach out again, I'd be ready to make a choice. Not from a place of desperation or hurt, but from a place of power. I didn't know when that moment would come. I just knew it would. But she hasn't moved on. She's just been preparing. 5 years after the accident, 2 months before my 29th birthday, I sat in a conference room with the executives of a Fortune 500 company and watched them agree to a consulting contract worth $750,000. It was our biggest deal, yet the kind of contract that would take Gray Solutions from a successful small firm to something legitimately substantial. When I walked out of that building, Sarah was waiting in the lobby, And we didn't say anything, just hugged each other with the fierce relief of people who'd bet everything on a dream and watched it come true. My company was now valued at $5 million. We had offices in 3 cities, 15 employees, a client list that included names people would recognize. My personal net worth had crossed $2 million earlier that year. I wasn't billionaire rich, wasn't making headlines or getting invited to exclusive galas, but I was financially secure in a way my parents had never been, even with my inheritance to pilfer. More than the money, though, I'd built something real, something that mattered. We helped companies that were struggling, found inefficiencies they couldn't see from the inside, implemented solutions that saved jobs and turned businesses around. My team respected me not because I owned the company, but because I worked harder than anyone else knew, the material better cared more deeply about results. I had a life that was entirely my own, built on my terms, funded by my work, answerable to no one but myself. It should have been enough. And most days it was. But Marcus noticed what I wouldn't admit. We were having dinner one evening, one of our monthly check-ins that had evolved from professional mentorship into something more like family, and he said without preamble, "You're 28. The statute of limitations in this state for fraud is 10 years from the age of majority with discovery exceptions, which means you have less than 3 months to file if you're going to." I set down my fork. I told you about that in confidence. And I'm telling you as someone who cares about you that unfinished business has a way of poisoning success. You've built something incredible, but you're still carrying this weight. I can see it. I don't want to sue them. Then why are you still checking their Facebook pages at 2 a.m? I didn't have an answer for that. At least talk to a lawyer, Marcus said. Get professional advice. Understand your options before the window closes forever. So I did. I made an appointment with Richard Brennan, an estate and probate attorney Marcus recommended. I brought the thumb drive with all of Patricia Kim's findings, the will, the trust documents, the bank statements, the forged signature, the emails about letting me die rather than use my own inheritance money to save my life. Richard reviewed everything over the course of 2 hours, making notes, occasionally shaking his head. Finally, he looked up at me with the kind of expression lawyers get when they're about to deliver news that's technically good, but practically complicated. "Your parents committed fraud," he said flatly. "Clear, documented, prosecutable fraud. You have grounds for a lawsuit. But statute of limitations is your enemy here. 10 years from your 18th birthday puts the deadline at this November. You turn 29 in October. You have about 3 months to file." "What happens if I sue?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "Long trial. Probably 2 to 3 years. Very public. Very messy. Your parents will hire a lawyer who'll argue that you knew what you were signing at 18, that the expenses were legitimate, that you're just being vindictive. You'll have to testify about all of this, relive it, air your family's dysfunction in court. You might win, the evidence is strong. You might not. Juries are unpredictable about family matters. But either way, you'll definitely lose your family permanently. What's left of it anyway." "I've already lost them." "Have you? Or have you just been waiting for them to prove they're worth keeping?" That question hit harder than I expected. I sat with it, turning it over. Was I waiting? And if so, for what? "If I don't file," I said slowly, "I lose the right to sue forever. The statute of limitations expires and they get away with it legally, even if morally they're guilty." "Correct." "Is there any middle ground?" Richard thought for a moment. "There's a legal maneuver. You could file the lawsuit before the deadline, but not serve the papers to your parents. Filing tolls the statute of limitations, preserves your right to proceed. But as long as you don't serve them, they won't know about it, and the clock doesn't start on their response time. Theoretically, you could hold that filed but unserved lawsuit indefinitely, though practically a judge might eventually require you to either serve or withdraw." "How long practically?" "A year. Maybe 2 if you have good reasons for the delay. It would give you time to decide what you really want." I left his office with homework draft, a lawsuit file it with the court, but keep it in my pocket like a loaded gun I wasn't ready to fire. It took me 2 weeks to draft it. Richard helped, but the words were mine, the accounting of betrayals laid out in legal language that somehow made it both more and less painful. Every dollar stolen, every lie told, every choice they'd made to value Sarah over me, culminating in the choice to let me potentially die rather than use money that had always been mine. We filed it 3 days before my 29th birthday. The lawsuit existed now, officially time-stamped and sealed. But my parents didn't know. The papers sat in Richard's office unserved, waiting. "What do you want from this?" Sarah asked me that night, sitting on my couch with Thai food and wine. "Really? I thought about it for a long time. I don't want their money back. It's tainted. I don't want revenge. That won't heal anything. I think I want to see if they're capable of honesty. If they're capable of apologizing without being forced to. I want to give them a chance to be better than they've been. And if they're not, then I'll know, and I can finally let go." "You're going to wait for them to come to you?" "Yes." "What makes you think they will?" I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because their world is falling apart. I can see it. And when it gets bad enough, they'll remember me. The daughter who was always so resourceful, so self-sufficient. They'll think I'm still that person who they can use without consequence. They'll reach out. And then I'll see if they tell the truth, if they acknowledge what they did, if they're capable of genuine apology. I'll give them one chance to be honest, just one." Sarah looked at me for a long moment. "And if they're not honest, then I'll serve the papers, or I won't. But either way, I'll know who they really are, and I can stop wondering if there was ever anything worth salvaging." The lawsuit sat in Richard's office, filed but dormant, a power I held but hadn't yet chosen to use. I went back to work, back to building my company, back to my life. But something had shifted. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't preparing. I was waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that the most powerful position is the one where you have options, and your opponent has none. She won't have to wait long. 8 years after the accident, on a Tuesday morning in September, I signed the final paperwork for the acquisition of Gray Solutions. A consulting conglomerate had been courting us for 6 months, and after careful negotiation, we'd agreed on $8 million. After taxes, after Sarah's equal split as my business partner, after paying out our team's profit-sharing agreements, I personally netted $4 million. I was 31 years old and had a net worth of $6 million. I wasn't Forbes list famous. I wasn't getting invited to exclusive galas or being featured in major publications. But in my industry, I was known, respected. I spoke at conferences about operational efficiency and building sustainable business models. I mentored young entrepreneurs through a program Marcus had introduced me to. I'd been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and featured in a regional business magazine's 40 Under 40 list. I'd built exactly the life I'd wanted. Stable, successful, meaningful. I had Sarah and Marcus and a circle of genuine friends. I had work that mattered and a team that had become family. I had a beautiful apartment, downtown, investment properties in 2 states, a retirement account that would have made my parents weep if they'd known it existed. And notably, gloriously, I'd done all of it without my family knowing any of it. They still thought I was Nicole, the struggling marketer, Nicole who'd needed strangers to save her life. Nicole who wasn't worth $30,000. They had no idea who I'd become in the 8 years since I'd disappeared from their lives, but I knew exactly what had become of them. I still checked occasionally, though less frequently than I used to. My fake Facebook account, which I logged into maybe once every few months now, showed me a family in freefall. My father's posts had become desperate, sharing articles about the housing crisis, about medical debt, about how the economy was rigged against ordinary people. My mother had mostly stopped posting altogether, except for occasional Bible verses about endurance and faith. Sarah's page told a different story. At 26, she'd cycled through 6 jobs in as many years, each one ending in drama I could piece together from her vague posting. "Some people are just jealous of success," she'd write after being fired. "Toxic workplace, so glad to be out of there," after another. She'd moved back in with our parents 18 months ago, a fact I'd learned from a passive-aggressive post from my mother. Family takes care of family, no matter what. The cracks had become canyons. I could see it even through the carefully curated social media presence they tried to maintain. The house, my childhood home, the one partially paid for with my inheritance money, was clearly falling into disrepair. I could see it in the background of photos, peeling paint, overgrown yard, a general shabbiness that spoke of people who couldn't afford maintenance. I felt nothing looking at these photos. Not satisfaction in their struggles, not pity for their circumstances. Just the distant observation of consequences playing out exactly as physics would predict. I wouldn't know until much later that on the same Tuesday I signed my acquisition papers. My parents were sitting at their kitchen table sorting through foreclosure notices. I didn't know that my mother, desperate and grasping, had suggested, "What about Nicole?" I didn't know that my father had laughed bitterly and said, "We haven't talked to her in 8 years. Why would she help us? She made it clear she wanted nothing to do with this family." I didn't know that my mother had replied, "Because we're family. Family forgives." And I think I saw something online about a Nicole Gray in business. It might be her. I didn't know that my mother had then spent an hour Googling, finding article after article about Gray Solutions, about the successful consulting firm founded by Nicole Gray, about the acquisition that had just been announced. I didn't know that she'd sat there staring at my professional headshot in a business journal, realizing that her forgotten daughter, the one she'd let nearly die, the one she'd dismissed as merely resourceful, had built an empire while they'd been drowning. I didn't know that they'd spent the rest of that evening crafting a plan not for honest reconciliation, but for manipulation. For how to reach out to me without admitting what they'd done, without acknowledging their lies, without offering any real apology. Just a carefully worded appeal that would play on whatever residual family loyalty they assumed I still carried. All I knew was that 3 days after I signed the acquisition papers, I received an email from an address I hadn't seen in 8 years. It appeared in my inbox on a Friday evening. I was working late, reviewing contract terms for a new consulting engagement, when the notification pinged. I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was spam. But something made me click. Subject line, "Thinking of you." I stared at those 3 words for a long time, my heart rate picking up despite myself. Then I opened it. "Nicole, honey, it's Mom. I know it's been so long and that's on us. Life got busy and we let too much time pass, but I think about you every day. We saw that you've been doing well in business. We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Your father and I would love to reconnect. No pressure, no expectations. Just coffee if you're ever in the area. We miss you. We love you. Please consider reaching out. Love always, Mom." I read it 3 times, analyzing every word like it was a legal document. Which, in a way, it was. A contract being offered terms carefully obscured the fine print, invisible. They knew about my success. That was clear from doing well in business. They'd found me, somehow discovered what I'd built. And now, when they needed something, they were reaching out. Not with honesty, not with apology, not with any acknowledgement of what they'd done. Just manipulation wrapped in the language of family love. I sat there in my office looking at that email, and I felt something click into place. The moment I'd been waiting for had arrived. They decide to reach out, but not with honesty, with manipulation. I forwarded the email to my therapist before I responded. I'd been seeing Dr. Chen weekly for the past 4 years, working through the layers of abandonment and betrayal, learning to separate who I was from who my family had taught me to be. She called me the next morning. "What do you want to do with this?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to delete it and never respond. Part of me wants to reply with everything I know, just dump it all on them and watch them scramble." but mostly I think I want to see if they'll be honest. Honest about what specifically? About anything. About why they disappeared when I was in the hospital. About whether they're reaching out because they genuinely miss me or because they need something. About whether they're capable of seeing me as a person instead of as a resource. That's a lot to test in a coffee meeting. I know, but I think I'll be able to tell. I've spent 8 years preparing for this moment. I want to give them one chance to be better than I think they are. And if they're not, then I'll finally stop carrying the hope that they might be. I drafted my response carefully, showing it to Dr. Chen, revising it 3 times before I sent it. Hi, Mom, I'd be happy to meet. How about next month? I'm in the city most weekdays. Let me know what works for you. Nicole. Short, polite, completely neutral. I didn't say, I miss you too, because I didn't. I didn't mention my business or my success. I didn't reference the 8 years of silence or ask why they were reaching out now. I gave them nothing to work with, no information to use, no indication of what I knew or didn't know. I wanted to see what they'd do with a blank slate. My mother replied within an hour, which told me everything about how desperate they were. That would be wonderful, sweetheart. How about the 15th? There's a nice cafe on Market Street if that works. Around 2 p.m., we're so excited to see you. Love, Mom, I confirmed. Then I told Sarah and Marcus. Sarah's reaction was immediate and protective. They're going to ask for money. You know that, right? People don't reach out after 8 years of silence because they suddenly realized they miss you. They reach out because they need something. I know. And you're going anyway. I need to see if they'll be honest first. I need to see if there's anything salvageable before I make my final decision about the lawsuit. Sarah pulled up the calendar on her phone. I'm clearing my schedule that day. I'll be nearby. Text me if you need an exit strategy. Marcus had a different perspective when I told him over lunch the next day. We were at our usual spot, a quiet restaurant where we'd been meeting monthly for 6 years, and he listened without interrupting as I explained the situation. You've been preparing for this moment since you found out the truth, he said finally. You've built yourself into someone who can't be hurt by them anymore. You're financially independent. You're emotionally healthy. You have people who love you. So the question isn't whether you should meet them. It's what you want to get from the meeting. Clarity, I said. I want to know if they're capable of honesty, if they're capable of apologizing for letting me nearly die even if they don't know I know about the inheritance. I want to see if there's any genuine remorse, any real love underneath the manipulation. And if there's not, I met his eyes. Then I'll finally be free of the hope that they might change. I'll know definitively that the family I wanted never existed, and I can stop carrying that weight. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said something I'd remember long after the meeting ended. Nicole, you've spent 8 years becoming someone extraordinary, someone kind and successful and strong. You did that without them, despite them, in defiance of everything they made you believe about yourself. Whatever happens in that cafe, don't let them convince you that you need their validation. You never did. You just needed to believe that yourself. The week before the meeting crawled by with excruciating slowness. I tried to focus on work on the new consulting contracts we were negotiating, on mentoring the entrepreneurs in my program, but my mind kept drifting to that cafe, to the meeting, to the question I'd been carrying for 8 years. Who were my parents really? Were they people who'd made terrible choices but still loved me in their limited way? Or were they exactly who they'd shown themselves to be when I was dying, and they chose to let me wait? I found myself running through scenarios. Maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd sit down and say, "We know we failed you when you needed us most. We're ashamed. We don't deserve forgiveness, but we're asking anyway." Maybe they'd finally really see me, and acknowledge what they'd done. Or maybe they'd do exactly what Sarah predicted. Sit down with carefully practiced warmth, ask vague questions about my life, wait for an opening to mention their own struggles, and then make their ask. Subtle at first, then increasingly direct. Could I help them? Could I lend them money? They were family, after all. Family took care of family. I didn't know which scenario I was hoping for. The first would mean I'd wasted 8 years being angry at people who were capable of growth. The second would mean I'd been right all along, and being right about something this painful is its own kind of loss. I spent the nights before the meeting doing something I hadn't done in years. I looked through old photos. Childhood pictures of me smiling at cameras, my parents beside me. All of us looking like a normal, happy family. Had it all been a lie? Had there ever been genuine love, or had I been a means to an end from the very beginning? A vessel for inheritance. Money they planned to use. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, deciding what to wear. Not too successful. I didn't want to wave my wealth in their faces. Not too casual. I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who made herself small for their comfort. I settled on simple but professional dark jeans, a fitted blazer, minimal jewelry. I looked like someone who had her life together without looking like someone who was trying to prove anything. I left for the cafe an hour early and walked around the block 3 times. My heart pounding. My hands shaking slightly despite my practiced calm. The meeting is in 1 week, and Nicole spends every day wondering, will they surprise her, or will they confirm her worst fears? I arrived at the cafe 40 minutes early and ordered a coffee I didn't drink. I sat at a table near the window where I could watch the street, where I could see them coming before they saw me. My hands were steady on the coffee cup, but my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. At 1:58 p.m., I saw them walking down the street together. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and he moved more slowly than I remembered, with a slight stoop to his shoulders. My mother had lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there 8 years ago, and she clutched her purse against her body like armor. They looked smaller than my memory of them, diminished somehow, like photographs left too long in sunlight. They saw me through the window, and my mother's face transformed into a bright smile that looked both genuine and practiced. They came inside, and I stood up, and there was that awkward moment where we all had to decide how to greet each other. My mother moved in for a hug first, and I let her, feeling her thin arms around me, smelling her familiar perfume. My father followed with a brief, stiff embrace, patting my back twice like he was checking if I was real. "Nicole," my mother said, her voice catching slightly. "You look wonderful. Doesn't she look wonderful, Tom?" "Very successful," my father said, and I caught the assessment in his eyes, cataloging my clothes, my watch, the leather bag I'd set on the chair. We sat down, and a waitress came over to take their orders. My mother ordered tea. My father ordered coffee black. The silence while we waited for drinks was painful, filled with the ambient noise of the cafe, but empty of anything real between us. "So," my mother started, her hands folded on the table. "Tell us about your life. It's been so long." "I'm doing well," I said, keeping my voice pleasant and neutral. "Working in consulting. I have a good team, staying busy." "Consulting," my father repeated. "That sounds impressive. Is it stable, good income?" There it was, less than 3 minutes in, and already he was probing for information about my finances. "It's stable enough," I said vaguely. "We saw an article online," my mother said, trying for casual and missing by a mile, "about a consulting firm acquisition. Gray Solutions. That was you, wasn't it? We're so proud of you, honey." So they'd done their research. They knew exactly how well I was doing, at least the public-facing version of it. They'd Googled me before reaching out, calculated my worth, decided I was valuable enough to pursue. "That was my company, yes." "An acquisition," my father said. "That must have been quite lucrative." I smiled, but didn't answer. The waitress brought their drinks, and we all busied ourselves with sugar and cream, and stirring anything to fill the expanding silence. "We've missed you," my mother said, and her voice carried what sounded like genuine emotion, though I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was performance. "Family is so important, especially as we get older. Your father and I were not getting any younger, and we realized how much time we've wasted being distant." 8 years, I said quietly. "That's how long it's been since we last spoke." "We know," my father said. And that's on us. We should have reached out sooner. We should have tried harder to stay in touch. The conversation continued like this for 30 minutes, surface-level pleasantries and careful probings, my parents asking questions designed to assess my financial situation while wrapped in the language of parental concern. How was my health? Did I own my apartment or rent? Was I seeing anyone? Did I have good insurance? The subtext under every question. Are you stable enough to help us? I watched them perform this dance, and something inside me was dying quietly. The last fragile hope that maybe, just maybe they were capable of being better than I knew they were. Finally, I decided to stop dancing with them. Mom. Dad, I said, setting down my coffee cup with careful precision. I have a question. When I was 18 at my birthday dinner, I asked about Grandma's inheritance. You told me there was nothing. Was that true? The temperature at the table dropped 20 degrees. My mother's hand froze halfway to her teacup. My father's jaw tightened in that way I remembered from childhood when someone had said something he didn't want to address. They exchanged a glance, an entire conversation happening in that look. Then my father cleared his throat and leaned forward, his expression settling into something reasonable explanatory like he was about to clarify a simple misunderstanding. Nicole, your grandmother didn't leave much, he said, his voice smooth and practiced. What little there was, we used to raise you. You got the benefit of it, your food, your school, your home, everything you needed growing up. You can't put a price on 18 years of parenting. He was lying, smoothly, confidently looking me straight in the eye and lying about $500,000 about my trust fund, about the car and the house renovation and Sarah's lifestyle and the $50,000 they'd spent on a vehicle while I was dying in a hospital. My mother nodded, adding her own layer to the deception. We did our best with what we had, honey. Your grandmother wanted you taken care of, and we made sure you were. We provided a good home, a stable life. That's what the money was for. I felt something crystallize inside me, sharp and clear and cold as diamond. This was it, the final test, and they were failing it spectacularly. I understand, I said, my voice perfectly calm. My father seemed to relax slightly, as if the difficult part was over. Then he reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of mine. Nicole, since we're being honest here, we need to tell you something. We're struggling financially. We might lose the house you grew up in, full of all those memories. The mortgage has gotten overwhelming, and with the economy, with everything, he trailed off meaningfully. We were hoping, given that you're doing well, given that we're family, maybe you could help us. Just a loan. We'd pay you back. My mother jumped in, her voice pleading. We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate, sweetie. But family takes care of family. We took care of you for 18 years. We're just asking for a little help now when we need it. I stared at them, these two people who had just lied to my face about $500,000 they'd stolen, who'd let me nearly die, rather than use my own inheritance money to save me, who were now asking me to rescue the house they'd partially bought with money that was mine. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. They were lying and asking in the same breath, denying they'd taken anything while demanding I give them more. And they genuinely seemed to believe this was reasonable, that I owed them this, that the 18 years of providing basic necessities to a child they'd chosen to have somehow created a debt I was obligated to pay. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing redeemable here, no love worth salvaging, no relationship worth mourning, just two people who'd always seen me as a resource to be managed and who were now trying to extract whatever value remained. I smiled. Calm as glass, serene as a frozen lake, I smiled at them. Let me think about it, I said, my voice pleasant and measured. This is a big decision. I need some time to consider what I can do. I'll be in touch. Relief flooded their faces. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you, honey. Thank you so much. We knew you'd understand. We knew you'd help us. My father nodded, already calculating, already spending money I hadn't agreed to give. Take your time, but not too much time. The foreclosure notice gives us 60 days. I stood up, gathering my bag, and hugged them both goodbye. They felt like strangers in my arms, which I suppose they always had been. I walked out of that cafe into the cool autumn afternoon, and I didn't look back. I'd given them one chance to be honest, to apologize, to show me they were capable of seeing me as something more than a convenient resource. They'd failed completely. Nicole smiles, calm as glass, and says, "Let me think about it. I'll be in touch." She leaves them hopeful, not knowing she's already made her decision. I texted Sarah from my car. "It was exactly what you said it would be. I'm okay. Going home." She replied immediately, "Coming over. Don't argue." I didn't argue. I drove home in a fog, parked in my building's garage, took the elevator up to my apartment, and walked inside to find everything exactly as I'd left it. Clean counters, organized shelves, the carefully constructed life I'd built. Everything in its place, except me. Sarah arrived an hour later with Thai food and wine. She took one look at my face and said, "Tell me." I told her everything. The lies about the inheritance delivered smoothly while looking me in the eye. The request for money to save the house my grandmother's money had helped buy. The complete lack of acknowledgement, apology, or even basic honesty about what they'd done. "They asked you for money after lying to your face," Sarah said flatly. "They asked me for money because they lied to my face. They think I still don't know. They think I'm still that girl who'll believe whatever they tell her." We ate in silence for a while. Then Sarah asked the question I'd been asking myself since I left the cafe. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." But that wasn't entirely true. Part of me knew. Part of me had known the moment my father said "just alone" while sitting across from me with his practiced expression of parental concern. After Sarah left, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch in the dark, my laptop open to the folder of documents Patricia Kim had compiled years ago. The will, the trust statements, the emails about letting me die. All of it there documented, undeniable. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos I'd saved in a folder I rarely looked at. There was one of me at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding my grandmother's hand. One of me at 13, already learning to make myself invisible, sitting at the edge of a family photo. One from my 18th birthday, the dinner where I'd asked about the inheritance and been told I was greedy for even wondering. That child in those photos had just wanted to be loved. She'd made herself small and undemanding, thinking that if she needed nothing, she'd finally be enough. She'd worked 2 jobs through college, survived on ramen, asked for nothing, and believed this was what strength looked like. And when she'd finally needed something, when she was dying, when she'd had no choice but to ask, they'd let her wait. Let her lie in a hospital bed wondering if she was worth saving. Part of me wanted to help them now. Not because they deserved it, but because I'd spent 8 years building a life on being better than them. I was kind. I was ethical. I was generous with my team, with my mentees, with causes I believed in. I'd donated more to charity in the past year than my parents had earned. Wasn't mercy supposed to be the higher road? Wasn't forgiveness supposed to be the sign of strength I could afford to help them? 30,000, 50,000, whatever they needed, it wouldn't significantly impact my life. I could save their house, solve their problem, and be the bigger person. I could prove I was nothing like them. But then I remembered the hospital. I remembered it in detail I usually tried to keep buried. The pain that felt like my body was tearing itself apart from the inside. The machines beeping steadily, marking time I might not have. The fear that was so visceral it tasted like metal in my mouth. I remembered calling my father, my voice shaking, begging for help. "Dad, I'll die. Let us think about it." I remembered the hours that followed, watching the phone waiting for it to ring, watching the door waiting for them to arrive, watching the clock counting down the time the surgeon said I had left. I remembered the nurse asking gently if there was anyone else I could call, and the humiliation of admitting that strangers on the internet were more likely to save me than my own parents. I remembered Sarah, my best friend, my chosen sister, working tirelessly to crowdsource money from people who owed me nothing. I remembered coworkers I barely knew donating their lunch money. I remembered a former professor sending $50 with a note, You helped me when my mother was sick. Let me return the favor. Strangers had valued my life more than my parents had. And then I remembered what I'd learned from Patricia Kim, that my parents had $35,000 of my inheritance money sitting in an account, that they'd discussed using it for my surgery and decided against it because that money was earmarked for Sarah's college, that they'd literally chosen my sister's education over my life. They'd had the money, my money my grandmother had left specifically to ensure I was taken care of, and they'd chosen to keep it rather than use it to save me. Sitting there in my apartment at 3 a.m, I finally understood something with perfect clarity. Helping them now would not be kindness. It would be enabling. It would send a message that their choices had no consequences, that they could steal and lie and abandon, and someone would always rescue them. It would tell them, you can take everything from your daughter, let her nearly die. Lie to her face decades later and still she'll save you. It would teach them that cruelty without consequence is just good strategy. And it would teach me that I was still that girl who believed love meant sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was only ever going in one direction. No, some situations don't need mercy. They need natural consequences. They need the kind of justice that comes not from punishment, but from allowing people to face the results of their own choices. I wasn't going to destroy them. I wasn't going to sue them or expose them or hurt them deliberately. I was simply not going to save them from themselves. They'd had chances, so many chances to be better, to tell the truth, to apologize, to show they were capable of seeing me as something more than a resource. They'd failed every single one. My parents were losing their house because they'd spent my inheritance money irresponsibly, because they'd bet everything on Sarah being their golden ticket, because they'd made poor financial decisions for decades. Those were their choices. Those were their consequences. And I was not obligated to rescue them from the life they'd built. I pulled my laptop closer and opened my email. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. I began to type, and the words came easily, as if they'd been waiting years to be written. She picks up her phone and begins to write an email that will change everything. The email took me 2 hours to write. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I kept stopping to make sure every word was exactly right. This wasn't about anger or revenge. This was about truth delivered with surgical precision. I started with the documents. I attached everything. Patricia Kim had found a PDF of my grandmother's will showing clearly that $500,000 was left to be divided equally among all granddaughters of my daughter, Margaret Gray. Bank statements from the trust account showing the systematic withdrawals over 18 years. The forged waiver I'd signed at 18, supposedly agreeing to let them keep the remaining funds. And finally, the emails, the ones where my parents discussed whether to use my own inheritance money to save my life, and decided my sister's college fund was more important. Then I wrote, Mom and Dad, I've thought carefully about your request to help save the house. Before I answer, I need to be honest with you about something. 5 years ago, I hired a private investigator to look into Grandma's estate. I know about the inheritance. I know she left $500,000 in trust for me when I was 5 years old. I know you were the trustees. I know you spent it some on legitimate expenses, much on yourselves and Sarah. I know that when I turned 18, you had me sign papers. I didn't understand papers that let you keep the remaining $155,000. Most importantly, I know what happened when I was in the hospital dying from internal injuries. I have the emails you sent each other. I know you had $35,000 of my money available. I know you discussed using it for my surgery. And I know you chose not to because that money was earmarked for Sarah's college. You let me lie in that hospital bed for nearly a week, terrified I was going to die, while you debated whether my life was worth more than my sister's tuition. Strangers on the internet saved my life because my own parents couldn't be bothered to use money that was legally, morally, and ethically mine. I've known all of this for 5 years. I've carried this knowledge through every success I've built, every milestone I've reached. And I've been waiting to see if you would ever tell me the truth, if you would ever apologize, if you would ever acknowledge what you did. Today, I gave you a chance. I asked you directly about the inheritance, and you looked me in the eye and lied. Again. You told me Grandma left nothing, that what little existed was used for my benefit. And then in the same breath, you asked me for money to save a house that was partially purchased with money you stole from me. The audacity is almost impressive. I paused there, reading what I'd written, making sure it was factual rather than emotional. Then I continued. I filed a lawsuit 3 years ago before the statute of limitations expired. I never served it, which means you've never been notified, but it exists. The documents are attached to this email so you can see exactly what I have. I could take you to court. I could pursue this legally, publicly, and win. The evidence is overwhelming, but I'm not going to. Not because I forgive you, not because I think you deserve mercy, but because I finally understand that I don't need anything from you. Not money, not apology, not acknowledgement. You've already given me everything I needed to understand exactly who you are. Here's what will happen now. Nothing. I won't sue. I won't expose you publicly. I won't contact your friends or your church or your neighbors to tell them what you did. I won't hurt you, but I won't help you either. You're losing your house. That's unfortunate, but it's the natural consequence of your choices. You took $500,000 that was meant to secure my future and spent it on yourselves and Sarah. You took out a home equity loan you couldn't afford. You made poor financial decisions for decades, always assuming someone would rescue you. I am not that someone. The house you're losing was partially bought with my inheritance money anyway. Consider its loss a partial repayment of what you stole. Not legally, you'll notice I'm not pursuing that, but cosmically. Karma, if you believe in that sort of thing. We won't speak again. Don't call me. Don't email me. Don't show up at my home or my business. I've built a good life surrounded by people who actually love me, and you're not part of it. If you violate this boundary, if you try to contact me or show up in my life in any way, I will serve the lawsuit. That's not a threat. It's a promise. You spent 23 years teaching me that I wasn't worth loving, that I wasn't worth saving, that my only value was in how little I demanded from you. Thank you for that lesson. It taught me to build a life so complete, so successful, so full of genuine love and respect, that I don't need anything from people who can't see my worth. Live with what you've done. I already have. Nicole. I read it through 3 times, changing nothing. Then I looked at the clock, 11:17 p.m. on Sunday night. Perfect. They'd see it first thing Monday morning, probably over coffee in the same kitchen where they'd decided not to save my life. I attached all the documents, 37 files, total hundreds of pages of evidence that their lies had always been lies that I'd known for years, that they'd been performing for an audience that saw right through them. My finger hovered over the send button for only a moment. Then I clicked it. The email whooshed into the void. No taking it back now. No more pretending. No more hoping they might be better than they were. I closed my laptop, took a shower, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. At 6:04 a.m., my phone started ringing. I was already awake, had been for an hour drinking coffee and watching the sunrise through my apartment windows. I looked at the screen, Mom's cell. I watched it ring, watched it go to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Dad's cell. I let that one go to voicemail too. Then text messages started flooding in. Nicole, please answer the phone. We need to talk about this. There are things you don't understand. This is all a misunderstanding. How could you do this to us? We're your parents. You're being cruel. We raised you better than this. I turned off notifications and set my phone face down on the counter. I didn't block their numbers. I wanted a record of their attempts to contact me, evidence in case I needed to serve the lawsuit after all. But I didn't need to read their messages or hear their voices. I'd said everything I needed to say. The conversation, such as it was over. At 6 a.m. Monday, her phone starts ringing. She doesn't answer. By 8 a.m. Monday morning, I had 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. I didn't read them at first, just glanced at the notification count climbing steadily while I got ready for work. I had meetings all day, a presentation to a potential client, a full schedule that didn't include time to manage my parents' panic. At lunch, Sarah texted, Are you okay? I'm assuming you sent it. Sent it last night. They've been calling since 6 a.m. Good. Don't answer. I didn't plan to. But I was curious what they were saying, what arguments they'd construct, what story they'd tell themselves about why this was happening. During a break between meetings, I sat in my car and finally read through the messages. My mother. 6:07 a.m. Nicole, please answer the phone. There are things you don't understand. My father. 6:15 a.m. We need to talk about this immediately. This is serious. My mother. 7:23 a.m. Sweetheart, we can explain everything. None of this is what you think. My father. 8:41 a.m. Nicole, you're misunderstanding the situation. We were protecting you. The trust was complicated. We did what the lawyers told us to do. Sarah. 9:16 a.m. Are you seriously doing this to Mom and Dad right now? They're crying. How can you be so cruel? That one made me laugh out loud in my car, a sharp, bitter sound. Sarah, who'd lived her entire life funded by my inheritance, calling me cruel for refusing to hand over more money. By Tuesday, the tone shifted. The apologetic veneer cracked, revealing what had always been underneath. My father. Tuesday, 11 a.m. After everything we did for you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We fed you, clothed you, sent you to school. And this is how you repay us. My mother. Tuesday, 2 p.m. You were always ungrateful. Even as a child, you were difficult. We tried so hard with you, but you were never satisfied. Sarah. Tuesday, 4 p.m. You're really going to let them lose their house. Mom is having panic attacks. Dad can't sleep. This is your fault. By Wednesday, they'd reached desperation. My mother. Wednesday morning. Please, Nicole. We're begging you. We made mistakes. Yes, but we're still your parents. Doesn't that mean anything? We're going to lose everything. How can you live with yourself knowing you could have prevented this? I blocked their numbers. Wednesday afternoon. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. I couldn't have their chaos bleeding into my work, into the life I'd built. I saved screenshots of everything, first evidence, in case I needed it. Thursday morning, Sarah forwarded me a screenshot my mother's Facebook post. Heartbroken tonight. Our daughter has abandoned us in our darkest hour. We gave her everything, our love, our home, every opportunity. We made sacrifices so she could succeed. Now that we're struggling facing the loss of our home, she's turned her back on us completely. Won't even return our calls. We're praying for her heart to soften. Pray for our family. The comments were exactly what you'd expect. I'm so sorry. Some children just don't appreciate what they had. This generation is so selfish. Elderly relatives I barely remembered sent me messages. How could you do this to your parents? Family is everything. You should be ashamed. The narrative was set: successful, selfish daughter abandons poor parents who sacrificed everything for her. I was the villain in their carefully crafted story, and people who didn't know the truth were believing it. I sat at my desk Thursday night after everyone had left the office, staring at that Facebook post on my laptop screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them tell their story while I lived my truth privately. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But another part of me, the part that had spent 8 years building something real and honest, the part that had learned that silence sometimes protects abusers more than victims knew, I couldn't let this stand. Not for me. For everyone else who'd been the forgotten child, the scapegoat, the one who'd been told they were selfish for setting boundaries with people who'd hurt them. I opened Medium and started writing. The title came first: When Family Steals Your Inheritance and Lets You Die. Then the story, all of it. Not angry or accusatory, just factual. Clinical almost. Here's what happened. Here's the documentation. Here's why I'm writing this. I wrote about my grandmother's will, about the $500,000 held in trust, about my parents' systematic theft over 18 years. I included screenshots of the trust statements with account numbers redacted but dollar amounts visible. I included the portion of my grandmother's will that clearly stated the money was for her granddaughters, singular at the time, meaning me. I wrote about being 18 and signing papers I didn't understand, trusting my parents when they said it was just formalities. About discovering years later that I'd signed away my inheritance while they smiled and watched me do it. I wrote about the accident, about lying in a hospital bed dying from internal bleeding, calling my father and begging for help to pay for surgery that would save my life. About the week I spent waiting for them to decide if I was worth saving. About strangers on the internet raising money to rescue me when my own parents couldn't be bothered. And then I included the emails. The ones where my parents discussed using the remaining $35,000 of my inheritance for my surgery and decided against it because that money is earmarked for Sarah's college fund. I wrote, they had money, my money. Money my grandmother left specifically to ensure I was taken care of. And they chose my sister's education over my life. Not because they were broke, but because I'd never been the priority. I explained about the cafe meeting, about giving them a chance to tell the truth, about asking them directly about the inheritance and watching them lie to my face. About them asking for money to save their house in the same conversation where they denied ever having taken anything from me. I ended with this, I'm writing this not for revenge but for clarity. My parents are telling people I abandoned them in their time of need. Here's what actually happened. I declined to rescue them from the consequences of stealing from me, lying to me, and valuing my life below my sister's college fund. I declined to set myself on fire to keep them warm. If that makes me a bad daughter, I can live with that. I spent 23 years trying to be good enough to earn love that was never going to be freely given. I'm done now. This is for everyone who's been told they're selfish for setting boundaries, for everyone who's been called ungrateful for refusing to fund their abusers' lifestyles, for everyone who's been the forgotten child. You don't owe them your suffering. You never did. I attached all the documents redacted for privacy, but clear enough to prove every word I'd said was true. The will, the trust statements, the emails, everything. I posted it at 11 p.m. on Thursday night and closed my laptop. The post goes viral overnight. I woke up Friday morning to 847 notifications. My phone, which I'd left on my nightstand, was buzzing continuously with emails, Twitter mentions, messages from people I hadn't talked to in years. I picked it up and saw that my Medium post had been viewed 127,000 times overnight. As I watched, the number climbed to 128,000, then 129,000. By the time I finished my coffee, it had hit 200,000. I got dressed and drove to work in a daze, not really processing what was happening. My article was being shared in Facebook groups for adult children of narcissists in Reddit communities, for people who'd cut contact with their families in Twitter threads about financial abuse. People were tagging domestic violence organizations, lawyers who specialized in elder abuse and inheritance disputes, journalists who covered family dysfunction. The comments section was overwhelming, hundreds of them growing by the minute. This is my story too. My parents stole my college fund and told me they'd spent it on raising me. You're so brave for speaking up. I've been no contact with my family for 3 years and everyone thinks I'm the villain. Your parents are despicable. They don't deserve to call themselves parents. I'm a lawyer and this is textbook fraud. You should absolutely sue them. But not everyone was supportive. Mixed in with the validation were comments that made my stomach tighten. Family is family. You should forgive them. Holding grudges only hurts you. Money isn't worth destroying relationships over. They raised you for 18 years, that's worth something. There are always two sides to every story. I'm sure the parents would tell a different version. This generation is so quick to abandon their parents. When they're old and need you, you'll regret this. The mixed response made it feel more real, somehow less like a uniform pile-on, and more like actual human beings grappling with a complicated situation. Some people got it immediately. Others couldn't imagine parents being this cruel, and so they invented explanations filled in blanks with assumptions that made the story more palatable. By Friday afternoon, the post had been viewed 500,000 times. Sarah called me between meetings. "Are you okay?" she asked. I don't know. Is this what I wanted? I think this is what needed to happen. People who've been through the same thing are finding solidarity. You're giving voice to something a lot of people have experienced but felt they couldn't talk about. And making my parents' lives hell in the process. They made their own hell, Nicole. You just turned on the lights. I found out later through friends of friends of friends what was happening on my parents' end. My mother's Facebook post, the one about her heartbroken prayers, was getting a different kind of attention now. People who'd read my Medium article were flooding the comments. You stole from your daughter. You let her almost die. You're not heartbroken, you're exposed. The audacity to play victim when you're the abuser. Someone had screenshot portions of my article and posted them directly in the comments. Someone else had found the public probate records showing my grandmother's will and my parents as trustees. The evidence was right there, and people who'd initially offered sympathy were now reading the full story and changing their tune. By Friday evening, my mother had deleted the post. By Saturday morning, she'd deleted her entire Facebook account. I heard through Sarah, who heard from her cousin who went to my parents' church, that people were avoiding them. Conversations stopping when they walked into a room. Old friends suddenly too busy to chat. The social standing they'd cultivated for decades, the image of being good, respectable people who'd raised their daughters well, was crumbling. Not because I'd destroyed it, but because the truth destroyed the lies it had been built on. Sarah was having her own reckoning. On Friday night, she posted a defensive message on Facebook. My sister is lying about our parents. They're good people who did their best. She's making up stories for attention and sympathy. Don't believe everything you read online. Our family is being attacked for no reason. Within an hour, someone had replied with a link to the county probate records. Public documents accessible to anyone showing my grandmother's will. Showing the trust. Showing my parents as trustees and me as the sole beneficiary. Showing that everything I'd written was documented fact, not opinion or accusation. Other commenters pointed out that probate records don't lie. That court documents don't have a bias. That this wasn't a he said, she said family drama, this was documented theft. Sarah deleted her post 2 hours after putting it up. Then Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in 8 years. Sarah's number, which I'd never blocked because I'd never needed to. Did they really let you almost die? I stared at that message for a long time. 4 years of being Sarah's scapegoat, of watching her get everything, while I got nothing, of being told I was the problem, the difficult one, the ungrateful daughter. And now finally a crack in her certainty. I didn't respond. Some questions answer themselves once you're willing to see the answer. By Sunday, the article had been viewed 800,000 times. It had been featured on several websites about family estrangement. A podcast about financial abuse asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed. 2 literary agents reached out asking if I'd consider expanding the story into a book. I sat in my office Sunday afternoon, alone, watching the view counter climb, reading comments from strangers who saw themselves in my story, watching my phone for any sign of my parents trying to contact me again. They'd gone silent after that first explosion of calls and texts. Radio silence for 4 days now. I'd won, I suppose. I'd told the truth, been believed, watched the people who'd hurt me face consequences for their actions. The invisible child had been seen finally, and people had responded with overwhelming support. So why did I feel so empty? Sarah found me there at 6 in the evening, still staring at my laptop screen. She didn't say anything, just sat down in the chair across from my desk and waited. I thought this would feel different, I said finally. I thought getting the truth out there, watching people believe me, seeing them face consequences, I thought it would feel like closure. Does it? It feels like nothing. Like I'm watching something happen to someone else. All these people telling me I'm brave, I'm right, I did the right thing. But I don't feel brave. I just feel tired. Sarah nodded slowly. Maybe that's what healing actually feels like. Not triumphant, just done. As the digital firestorm rages, Nicole is sitting in her office watching it unfold, feeling empty. The firestorm burned itself out over the course of 2 weeks. The view count on my Medium post eventually plateaued around 1.2 million. The comments slowed. The shares tapered off. The internet moved on to the next story, the next outrage, the next piece of content designed to provoke reaction. But the consequences were real and lasting. I learned what happened to my parents through the same channels I'd always used, through Sarah's cousin, through mutual acquaintances, through public records I could access online. 3 months after my post went viral, the foreclosure was finalized. The house I'd grown up in, the one partially bought with my inheritance money, was sold at auction. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex on the edge of town, the kind of place where the parking lot is cracked and the paint is peeling. My father had a heart attack 2 weeks after they moved. Stress-induced, non-fatal, but serious enough to require surgery and rehabilitation. He was 63 and suddenly looked 80, according to Sarah's cousin, who saw him at the grocery store. My mother took a part-time job there, actually stocking shelves and working the register. I heard she wore a name tag and said, "Thank you for shopping with us," 100 times a day to people who'd once been her peers. They weren't destitute. They had Social Security, my father's pension, enough to survive. But they'd lost the comfortable middle-class life they'd maintained for decades. More than that, they'd lost something that had mattered more to them than I ever had: their reputation. Sarah's cousin reported that people at their church, people who'd read my story, had started avoiding them. Not dramatically, no one confronted them or called them out publicly. They were just suddenly on the outside of conversations, no longer invited to Bible study groups or volunteer committees. The church leadership had quietly asked them to step back from their positions teaching Sunday school and managing the food bank. Too much controversy, they were told. Best to give it time. Their neighbors in the apartment complex didn't know who they were, which was probably a mercy. But they'd lost the community they'd spent 30 years building, and the silence must have been deafening. I felt nothing hearing about these consequences. Not satisfaction, not pity. Just the distant observation of cause and effect playing out exactly as it should. Sarah's story was different, more complicated. She'd moved out of my parents' apartment a month after they moved in. The viral post had cost her a job. Her employer had found the story put together that she was the sister mentioned and decided they didn't want that association. She'd lost friends too, people who'd read what she'd posted defending our parents and then seen the proof that she'd been defending thieves. She'd gotten a new job as a receptionist at a dental office. It was humble work, answering phones and scheduling appointments, probably the first honest job she'd ever had. Sarah's cousin reported she'd started therapy, that she'd been seen crying in her car in the parking lot after sessions. I understood why. She was processing that her entire identity had been built on a lie, that she'd been the golden child in a rigged game, that our parents had used her as much as they'd used me, just differently. They'd made her their favorite so they could justify abandoning me. They'd given her everything so they could excuse giving me nothing. She'd been a pawn too, and now she had to face what that meant about her life, her choices, her complicity. Part of me felt sorry for her. Most of me felt nothing. The unexpected part was how I felt. I'd thought exposing the truth would bring closure, vindication, peace. Instead, I felt tired. The post had brought validation, thousands of comments from people saying, "Me too," saying I'd given voice to their pain, saying I was brave. But it had also brought criticism, judgment, endless dissection of my choices. People who didn't know me had opinions about whether I should forgive, whether I was too harsh, whether money was worth destroying family over. I'd had to make all my social media private. Business contacts would occasionally bring it up awkwardly, asking about that family situation with careful faces. Some opportunities fell through because people didn't want to be associated with controversy. A speaking engagement was canceled because the organizer thought my story was too divisive. I didn't regret my choices. I'd do it all again. But I learned something I hadn't expected. Justice doesn't equal healing. Watching my parents lose their house and their reputation didn't fill the hole their absence had left. It just cleared the space where I'd been hoping love might grow, revealing that the ground had always been barren. I went to therapy twice a week for months. Dr. Chen helped me understand that what I was feeling wasn't weakness or doubt, it was grief. I was grieving the family I'd never had, the parents who'd never existed outside my childhood hopes. The viral post had given me vindication, but it had also made the loss permanent in a way that silence never had. "You burned a bridge," Dr. Chen said during one session. "It was a bridge that needed burning. But you're still standing in the ashes, and ashes are ashes whether the fire was justified or not." Life went on. I focused on work, on building my investments, on being a good mentor to young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself. Sarah, my best friend, got engaged. Marcus celebrated his 68th birthday. I dated someone for a few months, but it didn't work out. I traveled. I built a life that was full and meaningful and completely mine. I thought about my parents sometimes, but less and less. They became characters in a story I'd survived rather than people I was still actively escaping from. The lawsuit I'd filed but never served expired eventually. I'd let too much time pass without taking action, and a judge dismissed it. I didn't care. I'd never wanted their money back anyway. 2 years passed. The Medium post stopped getting daily views. My parents became people I used to know. Sarah remained a stranger. Life, as it does, moved forward. And then one Tuesday morning in March, something unexpected arrived in my mailbox. And then 2 years later, something unexpected arrives in her mailbox. The envelope was handwritten, addressed to my office rather than my home. That detail alone told me it was important someone had taken the time to find my business address, to write by hand, to use a real stamp in an age of instant digital communication. I was 33, sitting in my corner office in a building I partially owned, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life well built. My company had expanded to 5 cities. We employed 40 people. My net worth had climbed to $8 million. But more than any of those numbers, I was happy in a way that had nothing to do with money. Mia had moved in with me 6 months earlier. She was a librarian, which I found endlessly charming. Someone who spent her days surrounded by books, who believed in the quiet power of knowledge, who had no interest in business or consulting or any of the things that defined my professional life. We'd met at a coffee shop on a Sunday morning, both of us reading in companionable silence at neighboring tables, and she'd asked to borrow my phone charger. She'd known nothing about my family drama when we started dating, and by the time I told her, it was old enough news that it didn't define me anymore. Just a story about where I'd been, not who I was. I had Sarah, who was planning her wedding and had asked me to be her maid of honor. I had Marcus, who'd recently announced his retirement from consulting entirely and spent his days woodworking and sending me photos of furniture he'd built. I had Dr. Chen, who I now saw monthly for maintenance rather than crisis management. I had a life that felt solid, sustainable, genuinely mine. The viral Medium post was old news. It still got occasional views, people discovering it 2 years late, finding it through searches about family estrangement or inheritance theft. But it no longer defined my public presence. I'd given a few interviews, declined many more, and eventually the internet had moved on. I opened the envelope carefully, noting the familiar handwriting before I'd even processed whose it was. Sarah's handwriting, unchanged from the thank you notes our mother had made her write as a child, from the birthday cards she'd signed with exaggerated flourish. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on nice stationery, the kind you buy when you want something to feel important. I sat down at my desk and started reading. "Nicole, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness or a response or anything at all, really. I just need you to know some things, and writing them feels like the only way I can say them without making this about what I need from you. I understand now. It took me 2 years of therapy, countless nights lying awake replaying our childhood, and finally having the courage to request the actual probate records to see the truth in black and white. But I understand now. Mom and Dad told me you were selfish. They told me you'd taken something from me. They sat me down when I was 16. Do you remember that summer I started acting different around you? That's when they told me about Grandma's inheritance. They said you got everything because you were born first, that it should have been split between us, that you refused to share. They said you were ungrateful for everything they'd done for you. I believed them because I was comfortable believing them, because it explained why they gave me things and not you, because it made me the victim instead of the beneficiary of theft. because it was easier than facing that our parents were capable of what they did. I was 16 and stupid and selfish. I'm 28 now and I'm just stupid and working on the selfish part. I did the math, finally. Really did it. Grandma died when you were 5 before I was born. The will said, divided equally among all granddaughters. There was only you. You didn't steal anything from me because there was nothing for me to steal. They stole from you, and then they convinced me you'd stolen from me, and I was so comfortable in my position as the favorite that I never questioned it. You almost died in that hospital, and when they asked me to text you to ask for reconciliation, I said, "How can she be so cruel?" I called you cruel for refusing to save them after they'd stolen from you and let you die. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so horrific. I don't expect you to forgive me, Nicole. I don't expect a relationship or even a response to this letter. I just wanted you to know I see the truth now. You weren't the villain in our family. You were the scapegoat. You were the child they decided wasn't worth loving the way they loved me, and I was too self-absorbed, too comfortable, too cowardly to see it. I'm sorry. Those words are inadequate for what I'm apologizing for, but they're all I have. I'm sorry I believed them. I'm sorry I was cruel to you. I'm sorry I never asked questions when you disappeared from our lives. I'm sorry I defended them when you were telling the truth. I hope you're happy, Nicole. I genuinely hope you have people who love you the way you deserve to be loved all along. I hope you've built a life that has nothing to do with us, that you don't think about us anymore, that you've healed from what we did to you. You don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even acknowledgement that you received this letter. I'm sending it because I need to say these things, not because you need to hear them. I hope you're well. Sarah. There was no return address on the envelope. No phone number at the bottom of the letter. No subtle invitation to respond. No call me if you want to talk. It was exactly what it claimed to be: an apology without expectation, an acknowledgement of harm done, a recognition of truth without asking for absolution. I read it 3 times sitting at my desk as the sun moved across the office windows, casting different shadows each time I started from the beginning. I analyzed the handwriting for signs of insincerity, examined the phrasing for manipulation, looked for any hidden agenda. I found none. It was just an apology from someone who'd finally understood what she'd been part of, who'd finally seen me as something other than the villain in a story our parents had written. I thought about responding, thought about what I'd say if I did. Thank you for apologizing. I appreciate you finally seeing the truth. I'm glad you're in therapy. Let's get coffee sometime and see if there's anything worth salvaging. But I didn't write any of those things. Instead, I folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, and placed it in my desk drawer. The one where I kept important documents, contracts. I needed to reference legal papers, things that mattered but didn't require immediate action. Not because I was angry at Sarah, not because I wanted to punish her with silence, but because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted from her, if anything. The letter was real. The apology seemed genuine, but I wasn't sure if understanding was enough to build a relationship on. I wasn't sure if I wanted a relationship with someone who'd been part of my pain for so long, even if she'd been manipulated into that role. I wasn't ready to decide. And maybe that was okay. Nicole reads the letter 3 times, then puts it in a drawer. She doesn't respond. Not because she's angry, but because she's not ready to decide what, if anything, that relationship could be. Sarah's letter stayed in that drawer for 2 years. Occasionally, I'd open it and read it again, considering whether I wanted to respond, whether there was anything to build on. But I never quite reached a decision, and eventually the urgency of deciding faded. The letter became just another artifact from a past I'd survived, important, but no longer urgent. I turned 35 on a Saturday in March. Mia threw me a small party at our apartment, just close friends, chosen family, the people who knew me not as the woman from that viral post, or the CEO of a consulting firm, but as Nicole. Just Nicole. Sarah was there with her husband, their toddler running around with sticky hands and infectious laughter. Marcus came with the cutting board he'd made me as a gift, beautiful walnut with my initials carved into the corner. My team from work showed up with wine and embarrassing stories. It was perfect and small and exactly what I wanted. The woman I was at 35 would have been unrecognizable to the 18-year-old girl sitting at that birthday dinner 17 years earlier, the one who'd nervously asked about her grandmother's inheritance and been told not to be greedy. That girl had been so small, so careful, so desperate to earn love through the negative space she created by needing nothing. This woman, the one I'd become, was something else entirely. I was the CEO of a company that had helped over 200 small businesses optimize their operations, save jobs, turn around failing ventures. I sat on the board of 2 nonprofits. I'd written a book about building a life after family trauma, which had sold well enough that I'd done a small book tour spoken at conferences about resilience and entrepreneurship and the complex intersection of family dysfunction and financial abuse. I'd been featured in Forbes and Entrepreneur magazine in a segment on NPR about women building businesses in male-dominated industries. I was known in my field, respected, someone whose opinion mattered. But more than any of that professional success, I'd built something that couldn't be measured in revenue or media coverage. I had a relationship that felt safe and genuine. Mia and I had been together for 3 years now, living together for 2.5, and there was an ease between us that I'd never experienced before. She loved me, not despite my past, but with full knowledge of it, seeing it as part of my story rather than the defining feature of my identity. We talked about getting married someday, about maybe adopting kids, about building a life that looked nothing like the one I'd grown up in. I had my chosen family. Sarah Marcus friends I'd accumulated through work and hobbies, and the natural drift of life. People who showed up when I needed them and trusted me to show up when they needed me. I had a therapist I saw monthly, a meditation practice, a life that felt intentional rather than reactive. I was free in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with self-respect. Free from the need to prove anything to people who'd never valued me. Free from the hope that someday they'd realize my worth. Free from the weight of carrying love that was never returned. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, 2 months after my birthday. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when I saw it in my inbox. The subject line stopped me cold. "Your father is sick." I stared at those 4 words for a long moment before clicking. "Nicole, I know I have no right to contact you. I know after everything that's happened you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you that your father had a serious heart attack last week. He's stable now, but the doctors say the damage to his heart is significant. He's in recovery, but he's not doing well. He's been asking for you. Not constantly, but in his more lucid moments, he asks if you've called, if you're coming to visit. I tell him you're busy, that I've reached out, that we're waiting to hear back. I know we've hurt you, Nicole. I've spent the last 2 years thinking about your article, about what you said, about what we did. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. I know we failed you in ways that can't be undone. I know I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the harm we caused, but he wants to see you before, well, the doctors aren't sure how much time he has. Just once. Just to see you. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. He just wants to see you one more time. I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for him. Whatever you decide, I'll understand. But I had to ask. I had to give you the choice. Please consider it. Mom." I read it twice, sitting at my desk with the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, the hum of the office going on around me. My father was sick. Possibly dying. Asking to see me. I waited for the rush of emotion I thought I'd feel. Guilt for not caring enough. Anger for being asked to care at all. Grief for the father I'd never had. Something. Instead, I just felt calm, centered, clear. I thought about the last time I'd seen him at that cafe meeting 4 years ago, watching him lie smoothly to my face about the inheritance while asking for money in the same breath. I thought about being 18 and hopeful, thinking maybe if I just asked the right way he'd acknowledge me. I thought about being 23 and dying, calling him for help, hearing him say, "Let us think about it," like my life was a business decision requiring deliberation. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for him to be different, for both of them to be different. Waiting for the moment when they'd see me, really see me, and realize what they'd thrown away. Waiting for the apology that would make sense of the pain, the explanation that would make it hurt less. I'd stopped waiting years ago. The viral post, the therapy, the building of a life that had nothing to do with them, it had all been about learning to stop waiting for people who were never going to arrive. My father wanting to see me before he died wasn't about me. It was about him wanting absolution, wanting to die with a cleaner conscience, wanting the comfort of reconciliation without having earned it. My mother reaching out wasn't about acknowledging harm. It was about managing his comfort in his final days, about giving him what he wanted, because that's what she'd always done. Neither of them had ever asked what I wanted, what I needed, whether I was okay. I opened my email and started typing. Mom, I'm sorry to hear about Dad's heart attack. That must be frightening for both of you. But I'm not coming to visit. I need you to understand that this isn't about anger or punishment. It's not about holding a grudge or being unable to forgive. It's much simpler than that. I don't need closure from people who never opened their hearts to me in the first place. You say Dad wants to see me, but he's had 17 years to want to see me. He had the year I was 23 and nearly died. He had the 8 years after that when I disappeared from your lives. He had the 4 years since I exposed the truth and you both went silent. He's had countless opportunities to reach out, to apologize, to acknowledge what you both did. He's asking now not because he finally sees me, but because he's facing death and wants to feel better about how he lived. That's understandable. It's human. But it's not my responsibility to provide. I've built a good life. I have a partner who loves me unconditionally. I have friends who show up when I need them. I have work that matters, and a community that values me. I'm at peace in a way I never was when I was part of your family. That peace didn't come from forgiveness or closure. It came from accepting that the family I wanted never existed and building something better. I hope Dad recovers. I genuinely do. I hope he has time to make peace with the choices he made, the daughter he abandoned, the inheritance he stole. I hope he finds whatever resolution he's looking for. But I'm not coming. Not because I hate him, but because I don't need anything from him anymore. Not his apology. Not his deathbed reconciliation. Not the comfort of knowing he thought of me at the end. I needed him when I was 5 and grieving my grandmother. I needed him when I was 18 and asking for the truth. I needed him when I was 23 and dying in a hospital. He wasn't there for any of those moments. I'm not going to be there for his. You say you've spent 2 years thinking about what you did. I spent 8 years building a life despite what you did. Those are not equivalent experiences, and I'm not interested in pretending they are. Take care of Dad. Take care of yourself. Find whatever peace you can. But do it without me. This is the last time I'll respond to contact from either of you. Please respect that boundary. Nicole. I read through it once, made 2 small edits for clarity, and hit send. Then I stood up, walked to my office window, and looked out at the city. At the life I'd built in it, the home I'd made, the people who loved me waiting for me to come back to them. I felt no guilt, no second-guessing, no frantic urge to unsend the email or call them or rush to the hospital, just calm, just certainty, just the quiet knowledge that I'd made the right choice, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. My phone buzzed. A text from Mia. Done with work yet? I'm making that pasta you like. Come home. I smiled and texted back. On my way. I gathered my things, said goodbye to my team, and left the office. I drove home through early evening traffic, listening to music, thinking about nothing more urgent than whether we had Parmesan cheese and if I should stop to buy wine. When I got home, Mia was in the kitchen cooking and dancing to music playing from her phone. She saw me and smiled, and I walked into her arms and held on for a long moment. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. I'm really okay. That night we ate pasta and drank wine and watched a movie we'd seen before. It was ordinary and perfect, this life I'd built. This life that had nothing to do with people who'd never valued me, everything to do with people who did. I thought about the girl I'd been at 18, at 23, at 28. How she'd needed so badly to be seen, to be loved, to be worth saving. How she'd made herself smaller and smaller, trying to earn what should have been given freely. I thought about the woman I was now, 35, and free, living a life that girl would have thought impossible. And I understood with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds the most important lesson I'd ever learned. Because Nicole has learned the most important lesson of all. Sarah's letter remained in my desk drawer unread for months at a time, then occasionally revisited when I was cleaning or looking for something else. It was there, acknowledged, but not urgent, a piece of my past that I might address someday or might not. The pressure to decide had faded, and with it the letter became just another artifact of who I used to be. By the time I turned 35, I'd become someone that 18-year-old girl at the birthday dinner wouldn't recognize. The one who'd asked about her grandmother's inheritance with such careful hope, who'd believed that if she just asked the right way, she might finally be seen. She'd been transformed entirely. I was the CEO of a thriving consulting firm. We'd helped over 200 businesses turn around their operations, saved jobs, built sustainable models. I sat on nonprofit boards, spoke at conferences about entrepreneurship and resilience, mentored young women trying to build careers in male-dominated industries. I'd written a book about surviving family trauma and building something better. It had sold well enough to surprise my publisher and me both. But those accomplishments, impressive as they looked on paper, weren't what made me proud. What made me proud was simpler and more profound. I'd built a life where I was genuinely happy. Mia and I had been together for 3 years. She was a librarian with no interest in business strategy or consulting or any of the things that defined my professional world, which made her perfect. She loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with success or achievement. She loved me for the way I made coffee in the morning, for how I got overly invested in true crime podcasts, for the person I was when all the armor came off. We were talking about marriage, about maybe adopting children, about futures that looked nothing like my past. I had my chosen family solidly in place. Sarah, my best friend with her husband and toddler who called me Aunt Nicole. Marcus, who'd become the father figure I'd never had, now fully retired, and sending me photos of the furniture he built in his wood shop. A circle of friends from work, from hobbies, from the natural accumulation of living intentionally in one place. I was free in a way that transcended financial security. Free from needing validation from people who'd never valued me. Free from the hope that someday they'd realize what they'd lost. Free from carrying the weight of one-sided love. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in May. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I saw the subject line, "Your father is sick." I opened it slowly, already knowing what it would say, what it would ask. My mother's message was brief and careful. My father had suffered a serious heart attack. He was stable, but the prognosis wasn't good. He'd been asking for me, wanting to see me one last time. She knew they'd hurt me, knew they didn't deserve forgiveness, but could I please consider visiting just once, before it was too late? I sat with the email for a long time, looking out my office window at the city I'd built a life in, waiting for guilt to arrive, for grief, for some emotional upheaval that would make the decision difficult. Instead, I felt calm, clear, certain. I understood what this was. My father, facing death, wanted the comfort of reconciliation without having earned it. He wanted to die with a cleaner conscience, wanted the reassurance that I'd forgiven him, wanted to feel like he hadn't been as bad as my viral post had painted him. But he'd had 17 years to want to see me. He'd had the year I was 23 and dying. He'd had 8 years of silence after I disappeared. He'd had 4 years since the truth came out to reach out, apologize, acknowledge anything. He was asking now, not because he finally saw me, but because death was forcing him to reckon with his life, and I was an uncomfortable loose end. I opened a reply and typed steadily without hesitation. "Mom, I'm sorry Dad is sick, but I'm not coming. Not because I hate you, but because I don't need closure from people who never opened their hearts to me in the first place. I've built a life I'm proud of. I have people who love me. I'm at peace. I hope Dad recovers. I hope you both find peace too. But I won't be part of your lives. Take care." I read it once, added one line, "Please don't contact me again," and sent it. Then I stood up, gathered my things, and texted Mia that I was heading home early. She replied immediately, "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. Just want to be home." When I walked into our apartment, Mia was there and she took one look at my face and opened her arms. I walked into her embrace and just stood there for a moment, breathing, being held by someone who loved me without conditions. "My father's sick," I said into her shoulder. "Possibly dying. My mother asked me to visit. I said no." Mia pulled back to look at me. "How do you feel?" "Calm," I said. And I realized it was true. I feel calm. I feel free. That night, we made dinner together, watched a movie, went to bed early. It was ordinary and perfect, this life I'd built. This life that had nothing to do with people who'd never valued me, everything to do with people who did. I thought about the girl I'd been at 18, at 23, at 28. How desperately she'd needed to be seen, to be loved, to be worth saving. How she'd made herself invisible trying to earn what should have been freely given. And I thought about the woman I was now, 35 and free, surrounded by genuine love, living a life that girl would have thought was impossible. I felt no guilt about the email I'd sent, no second guessing, no wondering if I'd made the right choice, because Nicole has learned the most important lesson of all. 6 months after I sent that email to my mother, I was sitting in a small recording studio being interviewed for a podcast about family estrangement. The host, a therapist named Dr. Lisa Martinez, who specialized in complex family dynamics, had reached out after reading my book. Her podcast had a modest but devoted following of people navigating estrangement, no-contact decisions, and the complicated grief that comes with leaving family behind. The studio was intimate, just Dr. Martinez and me across from each other with microphones between us, soundproofing on the walls, making everything feel hushed and safe. We'd been talking for about 40 minutes, covering my story in broad strokes, when she asked the question I'd been asked 100 times in 100 different ways. "Do you regret cutting off your family?" I'd learned to pause before answering questions like this, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the question itself contained assumptions that needed unpacking. "I don't see it as cutting them off," I said carefully. "I see it as refusing to set myself on fire to keep them warm. That framing matters because cutting off implies I did something to them. What I actually did was stop allowing them to do something to me, Doctor." Martinez nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Can you say more about that distinction? For years, I thought family meant sacrifice. I thought love meant making myself smaller so others could be bigger. I thought being a good daughter meant accepting whatever treatment my parents deemed appropriate and being grateful for it. That's not family. That's not love. That's just conditioning. So what is family in your view? Real family, chosen or biological, means mutual respect, love, support. It means people who show up for each other, who value each other's well-being, who make space for each other's needs. Blood relation doesn't obligate you to abuse. Being someone's parent doesn't give you the right to steal from them, lie to them, abandon them when they're dying. Those aren't family behaviors. Those are abusive behaviors. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment, letting that sit. Then she asked, "What would you tell someone who's in a situation similar to what you experienced? Someone who's considering estrangement but feels guilty about it?" I'd thought about this question a lot over the past few years. I'd answered it in comments on my Medium post, in emails from readers of my book, in conversations with people who'd recognized their own stories in mine. First, your feelings are valid. All of them. The anger, the grief, the guilt, the relief, the confusion, all of it is valid. You're not wrong for feeling hurt by people who hurt you, even if those people are your parents. Second, leaving is not failure. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is remove yourself from a situation that's slowly killing you. That's not weakness. That's self-preservation. Third, you don't owe anyone forgiveness if they're not sorry. Forgiveness isn't a debt you pay for the crime of being hurt. It's something you might choose to give if the person who hurt you acknowledges the harm, takes responsibility, and makes genuine amends. But if they're not sorry, if they're still lying or minimizing or blaming you, you don't owe them absolution. I paused, gathering my thoughts for the fourth point, the one I'd learned most slowly. And fourth, the family you choose is just as valid as the one you're born into. Maybe more valid because it's built on mutual choice and genuine love instead of biological accident and social obligation. I have a family now, my partner Mia, my best friend Sarah, my mentor Marcus, my team at work friends who've become family through years of showing up for each other. They're my family because they chose to love me and I chose to love them back. That reciprocity, that mutual valuing, that's what family should be. That's beautiful, Dr. Martinez said softly. And it sounds like you've found real peace with your decision. I have. It took years of therapy, years of grieving a family I never actually had, years of learning that I wasn't the problem. But yes, I'm at peace. My life is full and meaningful and built on genuine love. I don't wake up wondering if today's the day my parents will finally see me. I wake up knowing I'm already seen by people who matter, people who chose me. Last question, Dr. Martinez said. If your parents were listening to this, what would you want them to know? I thought about that for a long moment. Thought about my father, who I'd heard through Sarah's cousin had survived that heart attack but remained in poor health. Thought about my mother working her grocery store job, living in that small apartment. Thought about them sitting together in their diminished life, maybe listening to this podcast, hearing me talk about them to strangers. I'd want them to know that I'm not telling my story to punish them. I'm telling it so that other people in my position know they're not alone, that they're not crazy for feeling hurt by their family's treatment, that leaving is an option, and sometimes it's the right option. My story isn't about revenge. It's about liberation. And if they wanted to reconcile, Dr. Martinez asked gently, then they'd need to do the work of genuine accountability. Acknowledge specifically what they did, understand why it was harmful, take responsibility without justification or minimizing. Not, we're sorry we hurt you, but we did our best. That's not an apology, that's a defense. An actual apology, actual change. And even then I might not be interested. Because I've built a life that doesn't have a hole where they used to be. It's complete without them. The interview ended shortly after that. Dr. Martinez thanked me, said she thought the episode would help a lot of people, asked if I was okay being so vulnerable. I told her I was. Because I was. The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with messages. This is my story too. You gave words to something I couldn't explain. Thank you for giving me permission to leave. I've been estranged for 5 years and felt so guilty until I heard you say it's okay. Hundreds of messages, then thousands. People sharing their own stories, their own pain, their own journeys toward choosing themselves over family members who'd never chosen them. I sat at my desk reading through them, crying at some, feeling validated by others, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who'd experienced what I'd experienced. The invisible children, the scapegoats, the forgotten ones who'd been told their whole lives that they were the problem. A woman wrote, I'm 62 years old and I just went no contact with my mother last year. Everyone told me I was cruel. Your interview made me cry because I finally feel like I'm not a monster. But a man wrote, I've been struggling with going no contact with my abusive parents. I felt like I had to wait until they died to be free. Your story showed me I don't have to wait. I can choose freedom now. A young person wrote, I'm 19 and my parents are exactly like yours. Everyone says, but they're your parents, they must love you. Thank you for showing me that some parents don't. And that's not my fault. Reading these messages, I realized something profound. The girl who'd been invisible in her own family had become visible to thousands of people who needed to see themselves reflected in someone else's story. Not because I was famous or special, but because I'd been honest. Because I'd refused to protect people who'd never protected me. Because I'd spoken a truth that too many people carry in silence. I'd turned my silence into a voice. And that voice was giving other people permission to speak, to leave, to choose themselves. I hadn't just survived my family. I'd transcended them, turned my pain into purpose, my abandonment into advocacy. And as she reads these messages, Nicole understands she didn't just survive her family. She transcended them. I want to speak directly to you now. Not as a CEO, not as an author, not as someone who built a successful business. Just as Nicole, someone who understands what it means to be invisible in your own family. If you're reading this and you've ever felt like the forgotten child, the one who had to be strong while someone else was allowed to be weak, the one who sacrificed yourself to keep the peace, only to realize they were never planning to make space for you, I want you to know something important. You are allowed to leave. I know that feels impossible. I know you've been told your whole life that family is forever, that blood is thicker than water, that you owe your parents everything because they raised you. I know you've been called selfish for setting boundaries, ungrateful for refusing to continue sacrificing yourself, cruel for choosing your own well-being over their comfort. But here's the truth. They don't want you to know you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to build a family from people who actually see you, who value you, who love you without conditions or scorekeeping. You are not selfish for protecting yourself from people who hurt you, even if those people are your parents. You are not cruel for refusing to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. You are not broken for wanting love that doesn't require you to disappear. You are someone who survived something difficult. You are someone who learned to be strong because you had no choice. You are someone who deserves a life where you don't have to keep proving you're worthy of love. Because here's what I learned, what took me 35 years and extensive therapy to truly understand: you already are worthy. You always were. Your worth was never dependent on their ability to see it. Your family doesn't get to steal from you, abandon you, lie to you, and then demand your loyalty. They don't get to hurt you for decades and then call you heartless when you protect yourself. They don't get to make you the scapegoat and then accuse you of being divisive when you stop playing that role. Forgiveness is not an obligation. I need you to hear that, really hear it, because it goes against everything we've been taught. Forgiveness is something you might choose to give if the person who hurt you acknowledges the harm, takes genuine responsibility, and makes real amends. But if they're not sorry, if they're still lying or minimizing or blaming you, you don't owe them absolution. You don't owe them anything. Boundaries are not betrayal. Setting limits on how people can treat you is not mean or vindictive. It's self-respect. Saying, "You can't talk to me that way," or "I won't lend you money," or "I need space," or "We can't have a relationship anymore," are all valid, healthy responses to unhealthy dynamics. And sometimes the greatest act of love you can do is to love yourself enough to walk away from people who never learned to love you properly. To choose the hard freedom of leaving over the familiar prison of staying. To accept that some relationships, even family relationships, are too damaged to repair, and that letting them go is an act of self-preservation, not selfishness. I spent 23 years trying to earn love from people who'd decided I wasn't worth it. 23 years making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding. 23 years believing that if I just needed nothing, I'd finally be enough. It took nearly dying for me to understand that I was never going to be enough for them, because the problem was never me. It was them. It was always them. And once I accepted that, once I stopped waiting for them to change and started building a life that had nothing to do with their approval, I found something I'd been searching for my entire life: peace. Real, genuine, sustainable peace. Not the false peace of avoiding conflict by accepting abuse, but the true peace of knowing I'm loved, valued, seen just as I am. That's what I want for you. That's why I'm telling you this story, exposing my pain, sharing the worst moments of my life with strangers. Because maybe my story will be the permission you needed to choose yourself. So here's my question for you. When will you choose yourself? Not tomorrow, not someday, not when they finally apologize or when they get sick, or when you've suffered enough to feel like you've earned the right to leave. Because that invisible child you used to be is still inside you, waiting for someone to finally choose them. Waiting for someone to say, you matter, your feelings matter, your life matters more than their comfort. Let it be you. Let today be the day you become the person who sees you, values you, and refuses to accept anything less than the love you deserve. You owe them nothing. But you owe yourself everything. Your move. If Nicole's story resonated with you, if you've been the invisible child, or know someone who has, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation? What would you have done in Nicole's position? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen without judgment. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about resilience, justice, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Hit that like button if Nicole's journey moved you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, that leaving toxic family isn't failure, it's survival. Remember, the family you choose can heal. What the family you were born into broke. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is love yourself enough to walk away. You deserve that freedom. You've always deserved it. Deserved.